Okay, today is Experiencer Day, Abductee Day, Contactee Day, whatever word you'd like to use to identify this particular phenomenon. As I think most of you out there are aware, there's a lot of different kinds of information coming forward about this phenomenon. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it neutral? Well, we're going to try to get to the bottom of these questions today. And to do it, we have 5 very distinguished researchers into the phenomena with us. Giles Hamilton, Dr. Richard Boylan, Dr. Edith Fiori, Dr. Karla Turner, and Dr. Jim Harter. So I'm going to start now with the first researcher to my left, Giles Hamilton. Giles?
Way back 16 years ago, there was a lady by the name of Lydia Stallmaker. I turned on the TV one afternoon, Channel 4 News out of Jacksonville. It showed Lydia Stallmaker out in the woods on the edge of Jacksonville with all the Channel 4 News staff, where showing them, talking to them, where she was picked up by a flying saucer. This was something quite extraordinary for 16 years ago. This fascinated me. Why? I hadn't been reading on flying saucers and UFOs and whatever. I actually hadn't had any great interest, but what she was saying on TV, the newsman, in detail, the whole 6 o'clock news was promoted to this. One thing led to another without making a long story out of it. I found a friend of hers, had a phone number. I called her, and after her UFO experiences, Dr. Harter worked with her just prior to me starting to work with her. And she related all these experiences, and I started hypnotizing her after Dr. Harter, and I think this phenomenon existed with her, possibly with Dr. Harter. I haven't talked to him about it. I haven't seen him in 15 years. But this alien being verbalized through her, channeled through her, communicated through her. In fact, she is, I believe, the 2nd chapter in this book. This alien being told me if I would cooperate with them, they would send me all of their, or maybe not all, but some of their contacts. I had problems accepting this, and I didn't know anyone to talk to about it. I called Dr. Harter. I don't know if he remembers this or not. This was approximately 16 years ago. Right shortly, I had a nice little letter from him saying what I encountered was reality, and not let it bother me all that much. So, her statement that they would send me their contacts if I would cooperate with them. I told him I would. It wasn't but 2 days later it started. There was this lady that come to me. I was carrying on as a regular professional hypnotist, doing stress control, weight loss, smoking, and on and on and on. Basically under doctor referral. I was a medical hypnotist. And this lady come to me for me to help her with her nurse's exam, with her retention, recall, and so forth. And I worked with her. She started to leave, and she seen something that said UFOs on it. We got out on the porch, and she says, "Giles, are you interested in UFOs?" I said, "Why, Mary?" She said, "Well, I seen something in there. Why do you ask this?" Says, "There's something I wanted to ask you, and I was afraid you would think I was crazy." I said, "Mary, after what I encountered the other night, which was this situation with the install. That guy thinks nothing's crazy anymore. I says, what is it? She said, well, just prior to coming out here,
It's the same thing here too.
I had a voice to come out of my head and says, go on, I got to come out. I stood there in the doorway with a cold chill running from my head to the bottom of my feet, because I knew what this was. And I said to myself, oh my God, here it is. I pointed back into my easy chair that's where I had just hypnotized her at, and I said, young lady, get back in this chair and let's find out what's going on. She went back, got in the chair, and put her back under hypnosis. One thing led to another, and she started visualizing this alien being and said that he had a ring, a huge ring on his left hand, and she could feel a lot of energy emanating from this ring. She says, really, it's more than a ring. It covers almost his whole hand. It's exceptionally large, and I feel this energy from it. We went on with our visualization. She kept focusing in and describing it. I don't remember the complete details now. This was some 16 years ago. The tapes in this pile of tapes, I got it home. But my abductions, my experiences, I got probably 400 hours now on cassette tape, possibly 100, 150 hours on video working with these people. And anyway, we went on. After this visualization of the ring, we started passing telepathic communication with this alien being. Thank you. Well, he bring this to a close. As soon as she left, I went back in there to replay this tape. Where we felt this energy at was about middle ways of tape. And when I replayed that tape after she left, where we started feeling this energy coming from this ring, after that, the last tape of this tape was wiped clean. The first tape of it was perfectly audible. It became a static on the tape, and it floated out and in. About the third time, then it was wiped clean, and it's 16 years old. Last time I checked it, it's that way today, and thank you very much. I've been slightly nudged here that I've used up my time, and thank you.
Thank you, Giles. Dr. Richard Boylan.
Good morning, students of the UFO ET phenomenon, researchers and experiencers out there. I'm Dr. Richard Boylan from Sacramento, California. I'm a clinical psychologist and researcher. Let me start with the chronology of my involvement in the UFO ET phenomenon and then begin to talk a little bit about the current path my work is taking. My interest in UFOs goes way back to when I was maybe this high, if you start with the table. 1947, when, believe it or not, I was a very young boy. That's the famous year Ken Arnold's sighting of a squadron of UFOs over Mount Rainier kind of marked the beginning of the public press awareness of the UFO phenomenon. And over the years following, including the famous 1952 flap of UFO squadrons over the U.S. Capitol, night after night, they couldn't cover up. I watched the debate between UFO researchers, amateur civilians like many of you, reporting what they saw with their own true eyes versus the Air Force press information officers saying it wasn't that, swamp gas, flight of geese and all that. And even as a young lad was convinced that the UFO researchers had the better of the argument. Arguably, as UFOs are, they made a lot more sense than the so-called scientific explanations why they weren't what they were. So I stayed with that for my life while I got on with my career and family. In 1977, I saw a UFO personally in the hills of Marin County above San Francisco, and that moved from an interesting phenomenon to a personal experience. My father was from Missouri, and I was sitting down there, you know, I'm from Missouri and I got to be shown. Well, I was shown, so that took care of the data problem for me. You know. Then things kind of leveled off at that level for a while, and then I watched the phenomenon move from UFO hardware to extraterrestrial contact. And at first I didn't know what to make of that. I thought some of the early contact stuff didn't sound too well rounded, and some possibly so. So I kind of held back. And then I saw some professional folks get into the field and take a chance. Dr. Leo Sprinkle of Laramie, Wyoming, counseling psychologist and professor, started publishing his works. And I figured, well, there must be something here. Then in 1989, and I'm in private practice doing counseling all day long for a living. I took a couple of days off to be here. People started popping up in my caseload who came in for entirely different reasons, you know, the usual family crisis or depression or whatever. And as we dug back into the earlier part of their life, in a few cases we ran across extraterrestrial encounter, sometimes fairly buried and sometimes remembered but shamefully hushed up. Many people are afraid when they were to tell a story to a psychologist or psychiatrist, they'd be, you know, fitted for a heavily starched white shirt pretty quickly. I didn't quite know what to do with it there, and then in '89, I believe it was, Dr. Edith Fiori's book Encounters came out, which she reported her work working with people with the experience in the South Bay area, and I was inspired by that to take a shot at it. Beginning in January of this year, I put out formal announcements to increase the number of cases I ran across over just what chance would bring in my caseload, and I'm up to 67 cases thoroughly investigated now. So I have some findings to share with you. We're not nearly going to get the time to do the subject justice today, but I do have my findings in a publication that's available out there in the back. Suffice to say that 30 seconds. No. The phenomenon is real. We'll talk a little bit about what I think I found. I take some particular pleasure in, I think, doing some, I believe, original research about the difference between people who have a mild experience and people who are heavily traumatized and what's really behind that, which I hope to share with you later. So, look forward to a very interesting morning.
Thank you, Dr. Boylan. Dr. Edith Fiori.
I'd like to thank you, Bob, for inviting me here. I really consider it a privilege, and it's been a pleasure, and I want to thank you all for being here in the audience. I never know what's going to happen when I come to a UFO symposium. In the last one, I met my soulmate, and we're engaged to be married, Richard Andrews, and that was in May. So that's By the way, he's in England. I mean, he lives in England. Actually, he's living with me now, but he was from England, so you see how the fates brought us together. So you're quite sure what's going to happen next. Back in 1950, a dear friend of the family, a playwright, and actually a screenwriter who wrote the beautiful movie The Red Shoes, handed me the book Flying Saucers Are Real by retired Colonel Major Donald Keogh. Hopefully you've read it. And I'd never even heard of flying saucers, and I gobbled up that book, and I was a complete and total believer. There was absolutely not the slightest doubt or shred of hesitancy in my mind. And I've never deviated from that position, even though I have some doubts about some other fringe areas, but there's just never been the slightest doubt in my mind. And later, in working with James Harter, I found out why there wasn't a doubt in my mind. But at any rate, that was long before I had started my formal training to become a psychologist. And I am a clinical psychologist, also in private practice in Saratoga, California, just south of San Francisco. And I began using hypnosis in 1973 and was using regressive hypnosis by 1974. And since then, which is almost not quite 20 years, I would say I should have kept a tally, and I can't, but it's too late now. But I would estimate that I've worked with about 400 people, patients, who didn't come for that particular reason, but came with various complaints. And in getting to the source of the problem, we uncovered the fact that they had had CE4s, close encounters of the fourth kind, which are abductions by extraterrestrials or contacts or experiences, whatever you want to call them, but in other words, some personal contact with them. It has been extremely illuminating for me. I never doubted that there were UFOs and obviously very intelligent and advanced beings, advanced in terms of technology, manning these craft. I also heard about these early abduction experiences. I had some doubts about the validity of those, but in working with people in my office and finding that they come in with a phobia or whatever, and then they remember this experience, and then at that very moment the problem is resolved, I know that something very significant has happened in the office, and of course happened to create the problem in the beginning. So my doubts about that are largely dispelled. Of course, you know, the subconscious mind is very, very creative, but I think that I call it clinical validity has been established. So I'd like to just pass the mic now and introduce that one to Carla. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karla Turner.
Good morning, and thank you also for having us here. I wish I had someone like Edith to go to when my husband and I were having stress symptoms that took physical tolls on both of us back in early 1988. We went to counseling to figure out why we were having such stress symptoms, and it was through relaxation hypnosis that eventually my husband suddenly began remembering some UFO encounters. We didn't know what to do with these, and like the rest of you, we were not interested in the subject. My background is in English. I have a PhD in Anglo-Saxon studies. I was a college instructor for many years. My husband was in computers. This simply was not part of our world, so we were babies about what was going on with our phenomenon. We knew nothing. We were lucky to make contact with an excellent abduction investigator named Barbara Bartlett, who works in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We met in the summer of 1988, and like you said, the symptoms do soon disappear. I know after perhaps 3 sessions of hypnotic regression, my husband's very severe symptoms totally disappeared, and after 1 session, my TMJ disappeared, putting off surgery permanently. Anyway, we began working with Barbara to figure out what was going on with us. And Barbara's background, I think, is as important as mine since we worked together in the research field. Barbara began in the mid-70s as an assistant to Dr. Jacques Vallée when he was looking into cattle mutilation cases in the Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas general area of the country. Barbara did the field work, and then when cases would merit further investigation, Vallée would come in and do that. As they were going through these mutilation investigations, abduction reports began to turn up. And Jacques was not as interested in these as Barbara was. And when they parted research company, if you will, in the early 80s, Barbara pursued the abduction reports. This was very fascinating and very important to her. She was the only person in the Tulsa area in 1987 who was doing this work when there was a literal invasion of this area. I think there was similar invasion reports from different parts of the country where the cases literally exploded. Massive sightings, sheriff's reports, videotape from the television crews, hundreds of people seeing these and reporting these, and concurrently many, many abduction cases at this time. She located one of the best hypnotherapists in Tulsa and began working on a voluntary basis with some of these cases. And when the caseload simply got too large for him to do on his own, he trained Barbara personally with his regression techniques and turned it over to her. He supervised for a while and then was convinced she was competent, more than competent, to go on with the work herself. When we began working with her in 1988, Barbara had already investigated over 200 cases in this 4-state area. She had a wide background in the varieties of reports of the phenomenon. Since then, and once we worked through our material, I became her assistant, and I work on the other end of it. I very rarely do any hypnotic regression, although I've been trained by her and by another hypnotherapist in the Little Rock area. In an emergency situation, I can do it, although I do not choose very often to do so. My field of expertise is writing about these reports, assessing the material that comes out of the cases, making the initial investigations and interviews with the cases when they first turn up. And since working with Barbara, our cases have now come close to about 500. So we have a very wide background upon which to draw our data to make our assessment of patterns and conclusions and the questions that really need to be dealt with. Currently, I also have organized and head up an abduction support group in the Central Arkansas area, and this has proven very beneficial to the people there. Oh, well, thank you. After lunch on the experiencers panel, I will talk about my book because this deals with the experiences that Barbara helped my husband and myself to uncover in our own cases, and this, of course, led us into the research. So I will talk about this a little bit later.
And the title is?
Into the Fringe. There.
Dr. James Harter.
Thank you, Bob. People ask me when I first, why I got interested in UFOs, and I must say it goes back to 1956 when I read Roofeld's book on the report on UFO unidentified flying objects, he called it at that time. And, well, have you ever had any sightings? Well, I've seen some strange things, but nothing stranger than people have told me about, but nothing that I would really say is a UFO. Except once Betty Hill and I were cruising around New Hampshire, and she was all excited about some lights in the sky over the lake, and she was so excited and convinced that I had to be sort of skeptical in response. But I must say, in response to later thinking that these colored lights that didn't move, didn't make any noise, and hovered no more than 1,000 feet over the lake, no more than 2,000 feet from us, was rather strange. But Rudolph just gave the date after he retired from the Air Force. About his 2 years, and he didn't say anything more than just the facts. He didn't come to any conclusions. But I'm a very logical person. At least I like to think so. And that was just sufficient evidence that I thought any reasonable person in the world would be convinced in an instant. Unfortunately, or fortunately not. So I became a part of the APRO organization, fairly soon became the research director, and when the case came up in Northern California, one of our members, Leslie LeBron, noted hypnotist and author, helped in one of our cases. I think that was the first hypnotic regression of a UFO abduction. That was in the early 60s, perhaps even earlier than that, except for the work that was done in Betty Hill in 1961. And so I've been at it more or less ever since, and I've been most recently interested not whether they're true or not. I was convinced of that 25 years ago. But what it does it mean, and why are people responding the way they are responding? Particularly, why is there such a negative spin put on it by certain people and in certain books? And who is behind this, and whether it's something that's based in reality, or is it based on some kind of misinformation and perhaps a sample of bias? I tend to think it's more that people who are inclined to find bad news will find it. And if they write books about bad news, and they invite people to write in and tell them about their bad news, they're collecting an enormous amount of data. With hundreds, perhaps even 1 million people who had some kind of close encounter in the United States alone, of which probably 95% are not remembered even. They have enormous data file. You can select out of that anything you want to, sort of like a biblical scholar who wants to prove a point. You can find scripture will support almost anything you want to say. So Rich Boylan and Edith and several of us are trying to see if we can find a broader picture, a statistically significant picture of what encounter would be like. And we find, I find at least, that only about one person in 20 has a bad feeling about what happened to her. In one particular case, I don't know whether we have the slides up, and they're not particularly, we don't have enough, I'll do that later. Don't worry about the slides right now. But of 105 cases that we went through, more or less because these were people who came more or less at random and had in common only their music results. About 1/4 that reported a real physical encounter. 29 people. Of the 29, only one person reported bad feelings about it. 9 reported, or 10 reported they were scared, certainly at first, but they didn't. They got over that. So my interest, what I would want to say is, what does it mean and what is its significance for the future of the Earth? I think that's the most important thing we need to address at this moment. Thank you.
Okay, now we will come around for the research and conclusions findings. Giles?
Yes, I would like to address this to Dr. Harter. I'm so glad he came out with what he said. 1 out of 10 having a bad connotation about this. And I thought it was such a wonderful thing. In one of the videotapes, I believe it was the lady astronaut from Russia, I believe it was here last year, I'm not sure, but she made a statement on this videotape, and it was so encouraged the way I feel, said that in Russia, if I understood it, they did not have a word for abductions, meaning as far as UFOs concerned. To them in Russia, it was just a beautiful, spiritual joyride in space. This done me a tremendous amount of good because so much of the time that's the way I find it. And with these abductions, which I don't like that term, but seemingly we stuck with it, like Dr. Harter said there, it's by the negative consultation that the person puts on it themselves through fear. I've done a regression the other day with a young lady. I more or less sweated blood with her for 45 minutes because she was scared slapped to death. They picked her up at 6 years old and put her through all of this, and she was hyperventilating and on and on and on, but this was her negative attitude towards it because she was just frightful. And if they wouldn't look at it from a frightful way, and do you feel this way about this generally, Dr. Harter?
Well, I find that people have an initial fear reaction, which they get over, and I think Rich Boylan has discovered that also. But usually during what I find is that during the hypnosis, if you ask the person fairly early on, are you receiving any messages? Are they saying anything to you? They will generally say, oh yes, they're telling me not to be afraid. And that helps them to remember that that was what they were told.
Thank you. I understood that, according to our friend here, I had another 20 minutes to talk about this, and this kind of leaves me at all. I'm not prepared for this morning because I don't want to double track on a lot of stuff, because myself and Ricky here, we having a 2-hour demonstration and a talk right on the stage here tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, I believe. It'll be about an hour talk, possibly 30 minutes demonstration, and question and answers, to where we go to attempt to channel an alien being through Ricky right here in the morning at sometime around 11:30, and this has been more of my research than working with the abduction, so to speak. It starts out with an abduction, what I do so much of the time, But then it goes beyond this, and all of these abductions we all hear so much about, degrees. I've only really encountered degrees to any large extent the last year. The first 13 or 14 years of my work, I was contacting, the ones I was contacting was out of this solar system, out of this galaxy. I want to look at it that they was more advanced than the Greys, possibly. They didn't have to go to this extent to go through all these abductions. The one that my people was in telepathic communication with, as I said, was from beyond this galaxy. They seemed so much farther advanced. If they wanted to find out something about any one of us, they didn't have to go through this abduction. They would just hone in their computer on and get any kind of reading they wanted. Anything pertaining from their past lives on. To any of their background, getting any information whatsoever they wanted on them without, they didn't have to go through this abduction. And one thing I found out, there was nothing negative about these people. Very scientifically, they didn't have emotions, good or bad. They had progressed beyond emotions, and again, good and bad.
I'm going to speak about the overall findings I found in my research with 67 subjects done in a very scientific study model way. So I feel both strong about what I'm going to share with you, and I think it will stand up to scientific criticism. You may or may not know that there was a conference on the close encounter experience at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in June. It was very covered up, not allowed to be reported widely in the press, and the proceedings still have not seen the light of day. I'm going to share with you what I shared there, plus more research. But you had over 150 of some of the best minds in the country, professors, Jim Harter, for example, clinical researchers, myself, and a number of others, and investigators from other disciplines. What's going to come out when those proceedings hit the press is we're going to have a conundrum in this country. Either we've got 150 of the best minds in the country that are clinically crazy, or else UFO and extraterrestrial contact phenomenon is out of the closet and certified by one of the hardest science institutions of higher learning with one of the best reputations in the country. I think the latter is obviously the fact. As to individual cases, 3 of the persons with the extraterrestrial encounter experience are here today that I've worked with, and I will let them speak for themselves rather than speak for them. And I think when you get acquainted with them and what they have to say, you'll draw your own conclusions about the kind of work I do, to the extent that I made any difference in the way they process their experience. I also want to establish my credentials a little beyond the scientific, although I have no particular feeling of a need to apologize there. I'm an experiencer myself. That happened after I had already started my research and been 3 or 4 months into it, when in April I had a close encounter. I don't want to get into that now, that's for another time. The last time I've had a close encounter with an extraterrestrial, not in face, but with a UFO, was last night near Area 51. And if I had rolled down the window and reached my arm out the door and driven a little close to the center line, I would have been able to touch it. And they played tag and safety escort with us while we were dealing with a very dangerous crowd near 51. And they even showed us how they do cloaking as cars and then uncloaking again. That may be a topic for later on. But to the research. One of the things I'm going to really put out here is that the definition of a close encounter, the fourth kind that I use, is someone who at least for one of their experiences had a three-dimensional being, physical body of extraterrestrial source show up close enough to them that they could reach out and touch the person or vice versa. Okay, that's my definition of a CE4. Now, I'm not putting down subsequent telepathic contact. I know for certainty that occurs where the extraterrestrial does not bother to show up in person, but maybe, I don't know what the range of telepathy is, but is reasonably close enough to do telepathic communication. That demonstrably exists and is often the method of choice of the higher evolved extraterrestrial races. They sort of get your attention by a personal visit, and then after that you learn to pay attention. I'm not putting down people who only claim telepathic contact with no physical show up, but for scientific purposes, so I can deal with some of the hard-nosed folks who want to be able to hit with a hammer and listen to a ring. That's the definition I use. So when you hear about 67 cases, they're that rigorous that I'm talking about. I'm also going to share with you a very major debate that went on at MIT, where I was on one side with Jim Harter, I believe, we would agree, and several other researchers, and Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs on the other, and a few folks in that camp. And to kind of make it oversimplified, let's just say it breaks down into this. The negative spin crowd, the ETs, are lurking, menacing, violative rapists, low-lifers, that if you could see them coming and get the drop on them first, you'd be justified in blowing them away. The other approach is to see extraterrestrials as initially scary, perplexing, confusing, and after a person is properly worked with, and I'll talk about that in a moment, a person generally, in my research experience, comes to see the contact as, on the whole, having more good points than scary or disquieting elements, and the net result is the person has felt they've had an uptick in their level of consciousness. I would submit from both the collective messages I've got from experiencers and from other sources, from other researchers around the country and the world, that the whole point of the general avalanche of contacts, both UFO sightings and close-up encounters, that has been peaking, particularly in this last year and will continue to peak into next year, is about a raising of consciousness. Some of this is on an individual level with a person by mind or, in some cases, physical manipulations that apparently have the result of raising a person's consciousness, attuning to telepathy, increased or the beginning of having of psychic gifts, etc., and a broader sense of our citizenship in a galactic community rather than I live in this country, you live in that country, and we don't think beyond the boundaries of planet Earth. So there's the severe trauma school that God, isn't it awful, and the expanded consciousness school of thought about what close encounters are all about. I have found, contrary to what I initially thought, because some of my initial thinking was influenced by some of the stuff in print that I found since to be unlikely to be true, that most people do not experience post-traumatic stress disorder level trauma from a close encounter. They may be scared as hell, but most people do not. And the people who do, I believe I found 3 reasons why they do. I want to share those with you. The 3 reasons are, with the people I've worked with, almost invariably, 1, they've had childhood sexual abuse, in some cases not remembered. And because of the nature of the way some of the extraterrestrial races do their medical scientific procedures, it flashes the person back to the childhood abuse. consider some of the parallels. There's the gynecological or urological medical exam involving, in some cases, probing or touching of the genital area. There are involuntary restraints against leaving in some cases. Some of the ETs get too close in your face. There are controlling behaviors by some of the less evolved ones. And then there's the repression of memory, either because of the shockingness of the initial experience or because the extraterrestrials induce a post-hypnotic suggestion that you won't remember the encounter, at least not until a later, better time. The other two reasons why some people seem to have an extraordinarily traumatic response are that they do not get the proper kind of debriefing and follow-up by the investigator. In some cases, the investigator has a bias or is leading in the way he or she does their hypnosis, the way they do their questions. The investigator already believes that, for example, all extraterrestrials are 3.5-foot grays who have no emotions and are very brusque and uncommunicative with the way they communicate. Or they lead in the questioning when a person is highly suggestible under hypnosis in ways that will cause the person to overfocus or exaggerate the parts of the experience that could become traumatic. The third reason is I have some very preliminary but compelling evidence, and others apparently are finding the same, that some of the traumatized persons are subjects of psychological warfare, staged pseudo-abductions with military or intelligence figures and aliens, or perhaps short humans in alien suits, conducting a pseudo-abduction experience using elements of hypnosis, drugs, electroshock, torture, terrorizing techniques. And as a result of that, these persons are traumatized, believe they've had an extraterrestrial classic experience, and are therefore harnessed to put out the word that these people are awful, become exhibits A through Z for the dark side analysis of what extraterrestrial contact is all about. When you take the people who've had varied childhood sexual abuse, the people who've been misguided and mishypnotized and led by a biased researcher, and the psych warfare subjects out of the crowd, I have not found anybody with post-traumatic stress disorder who's been properly counseled and with follow-through. Let me share some other research with you. Sects of people showing up saying, I've had a close encounter, can you help me get a handle on this? Women, 54%, men, 45%. The age of people showing up, 38. These are not all young people. The youngest I've talked to is a 3-year-old, and the oldest I've talked to is a 61-year-old. I do not mean to suggest that there's not 80 and 90-year-olds walking around. I have anecdotal evidence from the 61-year-old that her grandmother probably had contact. This is not a 1947 phenomenon. How much do people recall a close encounter before they've had therapy and hypnosis? In my research, 9% have complete recall, 72% have partial, and 7% have no recall. It just comes out while something else is being looked at. Most people have enough of a hunch, a guess, or a partial memory fragment that they come in, of course. What's the degree of psychological reaction after a person's had a close encounter the 4th time? I find 23% have no symptoms. As a matter of fact, it was a cosmic meeting, interesting, a little shaky perhaps, but just transitorily so, and they're fine. People who've had what I call close encounter extraterrestrial encounter syndrome, and I'll define that in a moment, I find 36% have that. A kind of mild level crisis that with proper handling and counseling soon settles down into, well, that was bad, and moving on with life. And the traumatic folks with enduring, life-disabling trauma, 27%. What's the mental sanity or insanity of people showing up saying, I've had a close encounter? Well, all I can tell you is my research population. Absolutely symptom-free, 66%. People with mild symptoms, they're not crazy, but they may have a little anxiety, they may be depressed, their marriage may be kind of shaky, 23%. People with severe mental disorders, 11%. In other words, 1 in 9. But that still leaves 89%, or 8 out of 9 psychologically sound. So we're not dealing with a bunch of Looney Tunes here. We're dealing with a very normal representative cross-section of the population. And 5 other research studies at MIT came up with the same conclusion. What's the people's attitude towards their close encounter after they've had some counseling? Positive, 61%, ambivalent. Saw a lot of good things, but some negative things. It was scary, or I'm puzzled, or I feel unfinished. 36%, negative, 2%. Let me talk a little bit about the vast majority of people's reaction to a close encounter from a psychological point of view. That's my specialty. And I want to pick what I've spent a little time on in defining a close encounter syndrome. Kind of mild level of psychological crisis that with proper handling soon settles down. See if any of this fits anybody you know who's had a close encounter. I would say if they've had 3 of the or more of the following 13 symptoms, they probably had a real close encounter. Repeated anxiety or unexplained restlessness. A fearful reaction to pictures or other cues that might remind a person of a close encounter. Classic one is, I didn't like that face on the cover of Communion. Chronic sleep disturbance or nightmares. Obsessional dreams or daytime thinking about UFOs or extraterrestrials or close encounters. Compulsive behavior concerning UFOs, like reading about them all the time. Unexplained moodiness or irritability after what might have been a CE4 situation. Body symptoms or signs of close encounter, scoop marks, laser, straight line cuts, etc. Feelings of social unordinariness, feeling like you suddenly jumped out from the pack of humanity and are in a special category. Intrusive cosmic awareness. People who used to worry about the stock exchange telling, well, now I'm kind of thinking about, gee, there are probably people out there in the whole planet, I got to get a bigger perspective. Sense of receiving telepathic messages or repeated gifted intuitions. A person wakes up one morning and suddenly is interested in physics or figured out the answer to some puzzling scientific thing. Sense of episodic shared mind space with one or more extraterrestrial beings. I'm not talking about the crazies who hear voices. I'm talking about somebody who's normal, but once in a while gets this kind of hunchy, messagey sense inside their head, or sometimes even clearer than that. 12, psychic or ESP ability, either getting it when you didn't have it, or if you had some, a whole lot more. And lastly, an obsessive sense of having a mission derived from the close encounter. And that sense of mission may be clear, it may be vague, or it may be unconscious, but you're kind of restless. There's something I should be doing. And often with hypnosis and counseling, a person comes to clearly relive and re-experience and hear what the extraterrestrials had to say to them and get their particular mission. And people have different missions. I'd like to say a little bit about how I do therapy. Everybody's got their own style. This is what I think seems to do the job well from my experience. Prompt intervention. Don't wait 2 or 3 years, but people, I know, I've talked to them, been sitting on this for 30, 40 years, decades, waiting to find somebody who was going to lock them up if they talked. I put an announcement out in the paper, friendly, sympathetic psychologist wants to talk about your CE4 experiences. People have been pouring in the door. They've been waiting, in some cases, for decades. reviewing the person's history with attention to remembered or possibly repressed CE4 episodes, listening with a tendency to accept the story rather than overcriticalness. If people are lying, bullshitting, or playing wannabe, that'll become obvious soon enough. I found you're better to err on the side of acceptance because we're still learning about the variety of races, the variety of styles, and the approaches. And it's too early to say, well, I haven't run across that so far, so you're probably lying. Okay, great. We're in good shape. Using hypnosis, and I think that should be done by someone who knows what they're doing, with no bias. And if the material that brings up is traumatic for the person, scary, creating emotional crisis, if the person who's doing the hypnosis themselves is not a professionally trained therapist, they should move the person over to a sympathetic therapist, sympathetic to this phenomenon, for working through the emotionality. I do not have an argument with people who are well trained and do good hypnosis and tag team with the therapist. Between the two of them, they get the job done where it needs that. And not everybody needs therapy. Some people just need grounding that they're not crazy, and to find out about the government cover-up. And once they do that, they realize they're normal, they just had an extraordinary experience and they can go on. Obviously, integrating what you come up with what you already remember from conscious state, providing a little reassurance, and very much important, connecting with a support group of fellow genuine experiencers. Now, not to offend folks, but there are some so-called UFO or experiencer groups out there that are really kind of contactee wannabes, or maybe kind of new age enthusiasts who are long on imagination and short on experience. But when you get in a crowd, in a circle with some genuine experiencers, it is amazing what goes on in there in terms of not so much emotional support, but consciousness sharing. And what I like to say with the group I work with, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Everybody comes in, brings a piece, and when everybody puts all this stuff on the table together, an amazing whole and very large picture emerges. Thank you very much. We'll talk more about this later.
Dr. Edith Fiori.
I've noticed that sometimes when I've given this presentation or one that's related to it, that there are reactions that you and the audience might have. So I want to just discuss that before I begin. You may find yourself feeling kind of sick or upset. And the best thing to do is just hang in there and take note of that, because that will be another piece of this jigsaw puzzle that Rich was talking about. I gave a workshop in Denver, that fateful meeting, symposium, and one woman left the room after feeling dizzy, went actually up to her room and threw up. And then she came back down about half an hour later. It was a 2-hour workshop, and went back to her room and fainted. And I didn't know what was going on. I just saw her leaving. And then later she told me the next day, so anyway, I put it in the hands of somebody who could continue to work with her, namely Leah Sprinkle. So you may find that you're having some reactions. There was a recent survey, the Roper survey, that concluded that approximately 1 out of 50 people in the United States has had the abduction experience, or CE4 experience, whatever we want to call it. That would be over 4 million people if they're right. And even if they're not right, let's say that half of those people have had experience. That's 2 million people. That's a lot of people. And what I find in my work is that most of these people have very little idea of this. In other words, people may come for help because of a phobia or whatever, and they uncover the CE4. They had no prior knowledge of it. But I'd like to do something that I often find missing in these presentations, and that is to give you a picture of the typical CE4 experience. I think that as a presenter, we often assume that you all know, but some of you, I know I talked to one man here who's here for the first time, so you may not be aware of what the typical CE4 is like. So I'd like to just, drawing upon composite cases, put one together for you. Let's call the abductee Anna. And the typical one would begin at night. Let's say she's about 34 years old, married with 2 children, and she's living with her husband and children in suburban America. And she would awaken in the middle of the night, maybe early morning, to find 3 or 4 alien beings standing at the foot of her bed, and they would be about between 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with large, oversized heads, sort of wrap-around eyes that look like they're wearing dark glasses, no visible nose, just 2 little holes, no visible ears, but from the side maybe holes, and a little slit for a mouth, a very thin neck, a small body in relationship to the head, kind of frail-looking, but actually very strong, with very long arms and long fingers, and generally 3 or 4 fingers rather than a typical 5 fingers. They, by the way, would be hairless. And to begin with, waking up at night, even with somebody you wouldn't expect to be there, is a rather frightening experience. But can you imagine waking up and seeing somebody there, or something there that is beyond what you've ever seen before? That in itself is frightening. Now, I would like to say this, that the reason that this is traumatic, which is sort of silly to say because it's the reason anything is traumatic, is because of the person's reaction to the experience. But I think it would be, and even I would be, after all the work that I've done, if I woke up out of a sound sleep and saw any kind of strange person in my room, let alone strange beings, my momentary reaction would be fear. And that's why we have the reaction of fear. This is a normal reaction. We're given this as part of our defense system, so that Anna feels fear. And then she is sort of immobilized in a sense. She can't scream out, she cannot resist. This is the typical pattern. And she is compelled to go with them, or propelled, and maybe even taken physically, one on each side, taken outside to an awaiting craft, which could be a shuttle craft, and she's forced into this. Now, at this point, her fear is mounting to panic. She gets into this craft, and she's taken into a larger craft, a mothership. So she's lifted up and taken into this craft. She's escorted into this circular craft, goes down a circular corridor, and into a central room that's also circular. Now, in this room, there's a table, a metal examining table on a pedestal base. There is a well-lighted room, but the source of the light is not obvious. There are other beings who may not be paying much attention to her. We'll call them grays. These are beings who are 3.5 to 4 feet tall. Usually there is a taller person who kind of seems benevolent, who it may be 6 or 7 feet tall, who is different from the others, who appears always to be the one in charge. Anna is told to disrobe, and she's more or less under their control. At this point, it's hard to resist. I feel that they're using a form of telepathy, so hypnotic suggestions directly to her subconscious mind and conscious mind, but it's because it's telepathic, generally speaking, maybe even combined with the verbal. She is rather powerless to resist, and she's still extremely frightened at this point. She gets onto the table, and a thorough examination, physical examination, is carried out. Now, she is there in her physical body. This is the typical CE4. First of all, every orifice of her body is inspected and looked into. So her eyes are looked into, her nose, her mouth is open, and either stomach fluids, the contents of her stomach are removed with a tube being put down into her stomach. And after that, or a greenish liquid is poured into her stomach, which seems to have a tranquilizing effect. Before this has happened, let me backtrack a bit. The taller being who's in charge usually stands standing in back of Anna with his hands on her temples and telling her to relax, and she would feel kind of goodness and love coming from him, and she would relax. So that from this point on, it's not quite as terrifying, but it still isn't fun. And it isn't like uplifting at this point at all. And the examination is carried out. Now, they will go down into the genital area, looking into that area, and of course she will feel embarrassed and humiliated because these are men and these are strangers, and this is being done against her will. And then they do a rectal examination. And at one point, they will put a needle into her navel and extract ova from her, whether she likes it or not. And if she protests, that's just too bad. And then, during this examination, an implant is put into her nose through the right nostril. There's a needle with a little, kind of teeny little crystal that's put into her brain. And, or that, this is, I'd rather give you all the variations, we're just going to do the typical one here. Now, this is important, and I think that this is, my viewpoint deviates somewhat from previous authors. Let's say that Anna has had a very severe yeast infection that has been incurable and very recurrent. A medical treatment is carried out, a healing treatment is carried out, in which some gel would be inserted into the vaginal area. And this would have a healing effect, a curing effect, so that not only has the exam been carried out, but there's been an effort to heal her for whatever problem she has. Let's say that's the only major problem or problem, minor or major, depending on how you look at it, that she has. Now at this point, she may ask them where they come from, and they may say the Pleiades, they may say Zeta Reticuli Sirius. Or they may not give her answers at all. And then she is told to dress, and as she's dressing, she is told that she will absolutely not remember this experience. Now, if she is a very kind of frightened type of person in general, she'll be more than happy to agree mentally, yes, I do not want to remember this. If, on the other hand, she's feisty, let's say that she's feisty, she'll think, I want to remember this. And she may have some anger involved with that, or she may just feel that this is quite an extraordinary experience, but she decides to remember it, even though they've told her she's going to forget. Then they will return her to her room, and she'll go to sleep, and she'll wake up and not remember it. But she may have, from that point on, a phobia of not even being able to go into that room, or having to sleep with the light on. So that would be, and also feeling insecure, so that she is left with psychological problems. So that is the typical experience that I have seen in working with, say, 400 people. And this is a composite person. Now, this is just one of a series of CE4s. Because if Anna came to see me for help, we would start with that one because she would have a phobia, which would be bringing her into my office. But we would find that she had had these experiences ever since childhood. We have a defense mechanism. We have lots of defense mechanisms that we employ to keep us stable. And one of them is called repression. And that is a type of forgetting that is not a childhood forgetting, but it's a squishing down and blocking out of our memory, creating an amnesia or partial amnesia for experiences. And because of that, these events are not remembered. But there are ways that we can figure out whether we've had the experience or not. And as a clinician, these are the things that I look for, and I have listed 10 of them, some of which Rich has already alluded to, but I'll go over my list. The first one is the missing time phenomenon, and that is where there is a period of time ranging from about 45 minutes up to, say, several days even, but usually it's about a few hours, in which the person absolutely cannot account for the time. Now, of course, this does not, we're not counting on being drunk or under the influence of drugs or anything of that sort, but there's sort of a blackout. And this can occur while a person is driving. All of a sudden, several hours have passed, they may even be on a long road, or it could be during the day. The problem with the missing time phenomenon is that a lot of these experiences occur at night. We're really generally not that aware of 2 or 3 hours that would be missing at night, particularly if you go right back to sleep. The second is nightmares or dreams, even one nightmare or one dream, but particularly repeated ones, of UFO or ETs. The third is sleep disorders. For instance, the sort of thing where you might wake up at 2:54 every morning, or have trouble going to sleep, or not being able to sleep at night at all. I had one student, college student, who couldn't go to sleep until it was dawn. Fourth is waking up with unusual bodily sensations, that's usually a tingling feeling or a paralysis or something of that sort, just feeling very, very different. And 5 are physical marks on the body. This, of course, is the consequence of the physical examination. Oh, I didn't mention that they would extract blood and take clippings of the nails and hair, and maybe scrapings of the skin. They would take little plugs of skin. So, of course, when this is done, it leaves a bruising, at least a scarring. 6 is feeling monitored, watched, and or communicated with. And of course, we have to discount those people who are really mentally disturbed. 7 is the sighting of a UFO. This is usually the only, a bit of the memory of the CE4 that is allowed in the conscious memory. The rest is repressed. 8 are vague recollections of CE4s, of one or more CE4s. And this is where the repression is not complete, where there's sort of like a feeling of maybe it happened, maybe it was a dream, I can't be sure. 9 are unexplained healings, because in 50% of my cases I found that people have been healed, sometimes of life-threatening illnesses. So that if a person has migraine headaches, and then all of a sudden one day they wake up and they don't have a migraine headache any longer, this may be a sign. 10 is reacting with fear and or anxiety about UFOs and or ETs. And as Rich mentioned, the cover of Communion has evoked a lot of responses from people. One of my patients actually urinated in the bookstore when she saw the cover of that book. Just lost complete bladder control. Because what she was doing is she was reliving with that loss of bladder control and with the emotions of fear what she actually had experienced before. You see, repression could not be maintained because of the similarity. In this case, the face of the book compared to the memory of the face that she had seen before. I think we have to ask the question, are these CE4s real? Well, we have the evidence of worldwide recurrence that are similar. In other words, what I just told you with the hypothetical Anna, a researcher in France or Japan or South America would be telling you. 2 are these remembered under hypnosis CE4s are similar to the ones that are consciously remembered. And some of these people are not sophisticated. They haven't read the literature. So it isn't as though they read a book about this, for instance, like my book, and then they come in and report this. Now, of course, many have come to me because of reading this book. I collected my data before my book came out, obviously. 3 are, there are multiple abductions with similar accounts. And maybe, I'm not sure of Carla's presentation, but often similar family members have been abducted, and under hypnosis or even outside of hypnosis, they report the same thing. Or it could be friends, kids on a beach somewhere who were picked up. 4, we have the marks on the body are similar to other abductees. In other words, the scrape marks, the puncture marks, the scoop marks, including nosebleeds, which of course are due to the implant. The reason that I feel that these are real is that the dreams that people have or the nightmares that they have, if the person is put under hypnosis, they turn into not nightmares or dreams at all. They're actually flashbacks to the experience. And most importantly to me as a clinical psychologist is the crippling symptoms that people have had that were eliminated by doing a regression to the CE4. In other words, as I mentioned when I was introducing myself, it just doesn't make sense for a symptom to be eliminated at that moment by somebody making up a fantasy. Let's say they've had a problem of very, very severe phobia for years, Does it make any sense whatsoever, when this phobia may have crippled them, that with 20 minutes of hypnotic regression, that is a little fantasy that they're making up, and now they're totally free? There's not a twinge of anxiety when they drive by that place or go into the garage or wherever they had the problem. Now, I'd like to talk about the effects of these seeking course, and I'm going to skim through this because we've got 2 minutes, okay? So I'm just going to read these to you, and of course, Rich did talk about some of them. First of all, the major psychological effect is fear. This can range from phobia to panic attacks, to mild fear to anxiety attacks, and these are ET, UFOs, being kidnapped, abductors, needles, medical equipment, monsters and owls because of the big eyes, and the dark. 2 are night terrors and nightmares. 3, insomnia. 4, sense of helplessness and powerlessness. 5, general insecurity. 6, sense of impending doom. And 7, fear of going insane, which is a terrible psychological effect. And I mean, I just can't imagine what that would feel like. On the plus side, we have the development of psychic abilities, which are healing abilities, seeing auras, being more intuitive, being able to read people, and developing precognition. Then we have the sense of a mission, which Rich alluded to, which is a world consciousness, a desire for world peace, maybe a political activism, getting involved in ecology. Also, another effect of these, which I also alluded to earlier, are healings. In 50% of my cases, there were healings, sometimes permanent, sometimes not permanent. And these can range from mild problems to life-threatening problems. I mean, really life-threatening, like an AV formation in the brain. So I will stop at that. Well, one more thing I want to say. I'm not going to get into cases at this point. I may later, but I probably have a minute or so left. Everything depends on how the person reacts to the experience, whether it's traumatic or not. If the person could overcome their initial reaction of fear, this can be an extraordinary experience, because think what it means. You're interacting with intelligent beings from another galaxy, perhaps, or other worlds. And it could be one of the most significant peak experiences of a person's life. So it just depends on how the person reacts to it. 2 people could react completely differently. One could be traumatized, maybe insane. I mean, I haven't had that kind of situation, but it's conceivable. And, well, we saw that from the presentation from AJ, the person in Brazil, he regressed to childhood. He was virtually no longer functioning. And the other could be that this person could become extremely powerful in the world in terms of bringing world peace, or using at least his own personal life, having a real beautiful meaning in his life as a result of the experience. The very same experience, so it's how we react to it that determines whether it's going to be a, quote, good experience or a bad experience. I'd like to stop on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fiore. Dr. Karla Turner.
I suppose if a person can learn to forgive and understand and sympathize with a rapist, it's not a bad experience. However, I don't think that that's necessarily good for the rapee nor for the rapist. All right, I'm going to give you some of my conclusions and some questions that I have about the research phenomenon and the research findings and reporting so far. Here are the conclusions that I've reached from the research with material from almost 500 cases personally with Barbara, and also with talking with cases from other researchers, not just the researchers reporting on those cases, but those cases themselves. I would say these things may be true. Aliens know our psychology and our physiology very well. They are not doing experiments to learn about us, they know about us. The nature and extent of their involvement in repeat abductees' lives is somehow actively exceeding the mere impact of the specific encounters. I can talk about that a little later. The aliens, whatever they are, and I use that term only as a shorthand notation. I have no idea if they're from another planet, another dimension, this dimension, whatever. But I will call them aliens just for convenience. Are physical and limited beings. They are not spiritual beings. The aliens use technology that allows them to manipulate other dimensions, such as time and space, which is so impressive to us that we may think their abilities to do this are natural rather than technological, and therefore that they have some spiritual edge on us. Aliens' deceptive dealings with humans makes them unworthy of human trust. For instance, they use screen memories to disguise conscious events, encounters, onsets, events within those encounters, and the closing of these encounters, and a screen memory is in fact a false memory. Therefore, it is deceptive. They present themselves in false guises using this same sort of device. They do not show us what they actually are. They show us images that are not real. This is deceptive. They give us false experiences that seem very real to us. We can have an experience that feels, in every sense of the term, real as you and I sitting here this morning, which in any objective sense of reality do not have. This is deceptive. Screen memories, such as the ones we've talked about and that you may have read about, not only extend to conscious events, but from the case work that we've been doing in the last couple of years, we have very good reason to believe that these screen memories can also penetrate to levels that even under hypnosis, once these are recovered, are still false memories and mask yet further, deeper events of a different reality. So I would say that I think it is imprudent to accept the actions of these beings at face value, and I think it is further foolish to accept their words as truth. So what do I think we can accept? What answers may we believe? If we look at the data openly, and looking at the available data that you can get in the bookstores now, and at the conferences now, and the presentations now, I think there are some questions about what we find presented to us. Now, abduction research, and I've done my homework and read everything I can available on it. I've talked with many other researchers, not only in the mental health profession, but outside of it, who have worked with these cases. Off the record, they have admitted that the reports they make public are censored. They are partial. They're in some ways not the entire picture. But Hopkins is proud of the fact, for instance, that he holds back certain pieces of information for his own purposes. That means that when you read these reports, you're not getting all the data. David Jacobs, for another, admits that in the material he used in Secret Lives, for instance, although he had a fairly limited number of cases, I think less than 80 to work with, he chose to throw out 17 of those cases before presenting the data because they didn't fit a neat pattern. Again, you're not getting an entire picture of this phenomenon. So therefore you're getting censored, partial, and therefore misleading reports on what's going on. And yes, there are typical abduction experiences. But for many people, what is seen as the typical abduction experience doesn't even come close to covering the variety of bizarre encounter events that they go through. They read these typical reports and say, well then, what was it that happened with me? If this is what really goes on with the aliens, I must be crazy, or I must be in some way out of the loop, and why are these things happening that I'm never reading about or hearing about? There is, in the hundreds of cases, not only that we've dealt with, but that others have reported on privately, although perhaps not publicly, a definite sexual aspect to the encounters. Not just reproductive, but sexual. Oral sex with a 5-year-old is not reproductive, nor is it some sort of physical, scientific, observable examination. This is just one example, we have many. There are a wide variety of physical marks left on the bodies of abductees, and not just the scoop marks and the straight line cuts. It's very hard to find in the reported data these varieties of marks being made available. So you may have marks that don't fit what you've been told is typical or what is officially accepted. There are many, many triangular marks, sometimes circles, discolored skin making triangular circular areas, puncture marks that make triangular areas. There are claw marks in wide, wide swaths. I brought a few of those with me if you're interested in looking later, that are not recorded in most of the data. There are many events that happen directly related to the abduction event that people go through that have nothing to do with reproduction or with the raising of consciousness or with physical examinations that involve such things as livestock and pets that we don't see any real logical reason for. Pets who are locked in one area, for instance, when an abduction occurs, are found in a different area with the lock still intact. Horses have been moved as far as 2 miles away out of a locked corral and into another person's corral at the time the owners of the horses were undergoing an abduction. We don't know what these things mean, but they are part of the phenomenon. You don't get these reports when you're getting the partial reports presented to the public. If we don't understand the peripheral or the nonsensical data, then we don't get a clear theory. We can't get a theory that's going to be acceptable or believable. We have to account for every bit of the data. Physical and emotional pain is somehow harvested by these beings also. It may be a byproduct in some person's mind that they're doing an examination that's ultimately for our benefit, and it just happens to cause pain, but they somehow take this pain or harvest this pain physically and mentally from the person that they are abducting. And sometimes they even induce a fictional experience, something that's not happening in objective reality but seems real, in order to generate extreme fear or extreme anger. And then this seems to be, again, harvested. We don't know what they're doing with this energy. We have numerous reports of aliens who have already had an abduction relationship with a being at some point in this experience, removing the abductee's psyche or consciousness from the body, installing an alien entity into the body, and then sending that human body out, unbeknownst to those around this body, using this as a vehicle for some other purpose. And often the psyche or the consciousness of the person whose body has been borrowed is allowed to watch this from some ship or other facility to see that their body can be used by these beings to do things that the person has no control over. Sometimes aliens threaten and demean abductees. I remember in September at a closed abduction support group that John Carpenter and Bud Hopkins and Linda Howe and several others had at the Missouri conference after this conference was over. There were about 30 abductees there. And when it came time for one particular person to speak, she introduced herself and said she wanted to apologize in advance to us for what she was going to be forced to have to do, that the ETs had not asked for her cooperation. They had insisted she would cooperate, and if she didn't, it would cost her her 10-year-old child's life. This is not an isolated case. In our own research, we have cases exactly like this, where parents are threatened that they must do certain things told to them by the ETs that they would not want to do, or else they will lose their mate or they will lose their child. And aliens start very early on in these repeated abductions to indoctrinate us, if you will, to brainwash us into believing that we belong to them, that we are dependent upon them, that we are indebted or obligated to them. Something along the lines of the Stockholm Syndrome of hostage-taking and of kidnapped victims. They tell children very early, we are your real parents, not those people there in the bedroom, in the house we just took you from. We are your real parents. They say that we are, in some ways, their descendants. For instance, I know in 1980 when I had an encounter with 4 beings, they insisted to me that they were my ancestors. And so we are obligated, or tied to them early on, as deeply as they can persuade us to be. Now I'd like to raise at least this thought. I know that I'm a limited person. I have human logic and human morality, and I think this is really what God gave me to work with, and therefore don't blame me if that's what I do have to work with. But I have to ask some logical questions. First off, the things that Edith has described as going on in a typical abduction, and not to mention the much more bizarre abduction experiences that do happen. If these things were done to one human being by another, would we call this consciousness raising? Would we call this the most wonderful experience of a person's life? Or would we call this abduction, an infliction of unwanted physical intrusions on our bodies? Now, while we're able to hold people who do that to one another accountable by law, and yet to think it's wonderful when it happens by non-physical beings logically escapes me. Secondly, there is such a thing known as the good cop, bad cop syndrome, when a person is trying to be broken down for either information or cooperation. The same force, the same group trying to gain this cooperation or information can take the two opposite approaches. At first, the person may be faced with someone who's very intimidating, very threatening. In other words, to bring them to that sort of frightened state of mind where they're in need of help, they're fearful and in need of help. And then the frightened or intimidating person is withdrawn, and the good cop comes in. That's all right, I'll be your friend, I'll take care of you, I'll make the pain go away, you can trust me, you can talk to me. And we're so much in fear and so much in need of help that we turn to this person and begin to develop a sense of trust. This works very well, human to human. And as I said at the beginning, aliens know our psychology very, very well. I think there's no reason to think they would not resort to such methods to gain our trust or our cooperation themselves. If you think of it, is it likely that a benevolent group or race down here for benevolent purposes would occasionally do bad things, harmful things, painful things to the people they're trying to help? Is it more likely that a group that is not benevolent, that has designs that may not be to our advantage, would sometimes do good things, healing, helping, spiritual statements or experiences to these people in order to either throw them off track or to gain their trust or to cover up an essentially sinister agenda? By human logic, the second seems more likely than the first. Now, we don't really have any answers. If anyone here or elsewhere tells you these are the answers, that person is lying. We have no verifiable answers. We have theories galore. We have assumptions. We have hopes. And we have fears, but we have no answers. There's no book to check these answers in. There is no verifiable source for anything that we may conclude at this point. There's a lot of divisiveness among the researchers. I think Richard talked about the two camps, and they sounded like, sworn enemies. I don't know how you're going to get any kind of answers if you've got camps in a standoff with each other. Your way is wrong and my way is right. No, your way is wrong and my way is right. This is not going to get us anywhere. At worst, it divides us and keeps us from putting the material together, and it may even indicate agendas on the part of some researchers that are not simply seeking answers, but are seeking something else. None of the theories that you're going to find out here today, none of the current theories account for all the reported data. They are partial. And everything about this phenomenon eludes scientific methods of proof and verification. So if we depend on a merely scientific approach, we're not going to get anywhere either. After years, literally years of research, as Bob pointed out, some of the best minds in the world, some of the best minds in various fields have been focused on this. We have no answers. No verifiable, documentable answers to even the most fundamental questions. We don't know the exact nature or origin of these beings. Now, somebody may tell you they do, but they can't prove it. Well, he told me he was from Zeta Reticuli. Well, that's not proof. The aliens sometimes seem to want us to love them, and other times they seem to want us to fear them, and we have no idea why. We don't know exactly what they're doing with our reproductive material and physical samples that they're taking from us, and they've given at least two implied and explicit explanations for this. One is, of course, the crossbreeding alien-human race that they're supposedly coming up with. They tell us that and they show us that, but again, they can be deceptive in what they show us, so we can't take that as proof. They have also shown and told other abductees that the reproductive material they take from us, including the fetuses, as well as the sperm and ova, are used to make their biological robots, all those little brains you see running around, the ones that most of you encounter. According to some of the things that these ETs have told their abductees, those are not ETs, those are robots, and they're made strictly from human material. The ETs are the ones in charge of them. So they're taking our fetuses and our babies, perhaps, and making the workers that they send out in the field to do most of the dirty work. Is this true or not? We don't have verification. We don't know the motivation behind the repeated alien predictions of a global change and chaos, and we don't know how far to trust them. They've made predictions in the past, none of which have come true, and yet they're making much more widespread predictions now. Again, how much faith and how much trust do we have to put into these? Is there another motivation for making these kinds of predictions? And again, I'd just like to say, with so many years of so much excellent research, why are we no closer to verifiable answers? Bob, how much more time do I have? 2 minutes. I don't have time to go into some sample cases that would show you the kinds of deception at work here, but I will say that very often people come away from the experience, even after hypnosis, and believe that they have had a benevolent encounter, that they've been given spiritual, uplifting information, and that they are special and chosen to have a job to do. With further probing beneath this recalled memory, very often extremely opposite experiences do emerge that involve anything but spiritually uplifting encounters. And so I would warn you that whatever you read, whatever you think, to be cautious of accepting any of it at face value. And I'll go into more of these experiences later. Thank you.
Dr. James Harter.
Now, following on what Dr. Turner has just told you, I hope she would be the first to tell you not to believe everything that individuals tell you in the analyses that she herself has made on the basis of her investigations. What I find is that people find the people that they want to find. And sometimes, as Giles Hamilton has said, they send people to him. Now, maybe there's a particular UFO group that are particularly fond of Giles. Maybe there's another ET group that's particularly fond of Dr. Boylan, and he gets them. Now we know in the vicinity where Carla lives, there's a fairly indecent type of alien abroad who are doing calculations, and that may be heavily involved. And people who have that kind of experience, who remember it, come forward, and you get 500 cases of that. What is 500 out of 500,000? You see, we are in the position, and I would agree with Carla now, I'm kind of like the 5 blind men who were trying to describe an elephant after their tactile investigation. And to do things on the basis of examples, now that's a famous journalistic point of view, that you can prove things by examples. You can certainly illustrate things by examples, and I can do that too. I had a telephone call recently from a woman who believed that various things had happened to her, and she wanted to get my help in getting this verified so she could appear on one of the television programs. It turned out that she believed that somebody had come down and taken her baby, her fetus, away from her. And she wanted this to be well known. Well, I said, were you pregnant? Well, of course. I said, had you had any sexual relations in the last year? Well, no. Did you see the fetus? No. Did they tell you they were taking the fetus? No. But how did you know they were taking your fetus? Oh, I know it in my heart. Well, what can you say about a person who can be fantasy prone? 5% of the population are fantasy prone. And what percentage of the people who give their ITs to be on the Giraldo show? Fairly large percentage, maybe 5%, maybe 2%. But that's a very large, we have millions of people out of which you can select whatever you want to select. Now, following Giles' point of view, he has not seen the grays until just recently, in his experience. It may be that the grays are a reflection of expectations on the part of the people who come to see the investigators. I've not seen very many grays myself. It may be that they're relatively inexperienced. Perhaps they're newcomers. They're not technically advanced. It's taken them this long to get here. After all, they've had 40 years, and it's just now that they're arriving, right? Everybody else got here in 1950. The good guys got here in 1950 because they could go a lot faster. They're craft. They're a lot better. They're more highly evolved in many ways. Now, it's hard for people to realize how many different alien groups are out there. There are 57 members of just the Federation. And that's just the good guys. There are about three who are renegades who just belong to the Federation and been kicked out for bad behavior of the sort that you probably heard a little bit about. And then there are scores of others that haven't even made it into even being accepted or even considered for being acceptance into the Federation. And some of those are working out for Rich Boylan as risking his life gathering information. And people who are psychotherapists, they get a certain spin on this because people come to them who are in trouble. I have not any problem with the facts that some of these things do happen, but I do have a problem in thinking that they are typical. I've myself talked with at least 500 people over the last 30 years. And I get a very different picture from what Dr. Turner finds. I don't find, for instance, that somebody tells you or gives you the impression that he's different from what he is. He looks like a blonde Nordic, okay? And then after I look at it, I ask the person a little more carefully to look at what it really was. And it wasn't blonde Nordic at all. Well, that's a bad feeling, you know, that gives you, they are in some way distorting reality. Well, okay, you go to a dentist.
He doesn't use Novocaine. He pulls one of your molar teeth without Novocaine, without distorting reality. Now, is he a better dentist than the person who gives you Novocaine first, who distorts your reality relative to pain? I ask you. There are some sorts of things when if an alien person who looks very strange, perhaps like your mother-in-law, or in some other way threatening, distorts reality to the point where he appears to be less threatening than he would otherwise appear, but perhaps a lot more benevolent than you would believe. Now, most of these extraterrestrials come from civilizations that have been around for a long, long time, sometimes millions of years. And they've evolved relatively high civilizations in which a lot of the things that we take for granted, like violence and crime and many other things, just are no longer known. It's very hard for us to believe that civilizations could exist that are very different from ours and inhabited by people that are very different from us. We tend to project a lot. We tend to project some of our own fears, and we tend to expect some of our own expectations. And so I would say that this very extraordinary and puzzling phenomenon, it takes people by surprise. I had a person who came back from a visitation. She was in tears. Oh, what's the matter? Well, I asked them how many people that the earth could sustain, how many people should live on the earth. And they told me 5 million. Now, she was concerned, of course, about what would happen to the other 99.9%. Not necessarily that 5 million was about the right number of people who live on Earth. Well, what do you think? If there were 5 million people who lived on Earth, we could all live in Tahiti and Malibu, and all of the nice places wouldn't have to live in Bangladesh and in the Siberian steppes, or in Boston for that matter. And so People come back with their own spin, their own personal reaction to these things. She was absolutely devastated by that information. Other people are devastated by the fact that sperm are taken or ovum are taken. I believe that that does happen. Not as often as people think, but it does. And what is being done with this? Well, are they making alien hybrids? That doesn't make any sense. The DNA is probably of a completely different sort. It doesn't fit. It doesn't read scientifically. And it doesn't even read logically. That they would use human sperm and ova to do other peculiar things doesn't fit scientifically or logically. They have all of the mechanical devices and psychic devices they need. So you see how much we tend to put our own fears into some of our own reactions. Now let me tell you some of the things that I do think they're up to. If we have the slides there, I would show you slide 12. Is slide 12 available? In the meantime, I'll tell you a little story about some people I met in Alabama, in the Bible Belt. Well, she said, I think they're all demons. She was out of the Christian tradition. I said, how is that? Well, they have to be. They're not Christians. Well, I said, they seem to at least claim that they're doing some nice things for people. Well, she says, they're just pretending to be nice until they really show their true colors. I said, well, many of the people who deal with UFOs or turn out to be more spiritual, would be more interested in helping the world, helping their fellow man. Oh, she says, they're just pretending to be like that. I said, well, if you read it in the Bible, Jesus said, by their fruits ye shall know them. I always like to quote the Bible in the Bible Belt. But here we have a slide that shows a group of people, 105 actually, who were divided by an analysis that I made into 4 groups. On the left side, group A, people who definitely remembered a UFO experience. B and C are people who had evidence of a UFO experience that they didn't remember. And on the right are people who had no evidence of having had ET contact. But things that distinguish the people who had a conscious memory, and even that held up even in the middle group, is a considerable concern for doing things to help the Earth. They're interested in ecology, interested in world peace, interested in all kinds of what we would think, many of us would think, to be good things. Another interesting thing that falls off rather strongly is psychic ability. Very strong on the left, but very little at the right. These people have been inspired in certain ways. So I say, by their fruits ye shall know them. I don't deny that there are certain people out there that are certainly either not concerned, or they're doing strange things, or they're doing things that are interpreted in certain ways. But I'm looking at the total and larger picture. And the picture I get, even beyond this, is that the ATs are really concerned about the future of the human race and the future of civilization here. They may have 2 reasons. One of them sort of selfish. They don't want to see another group of cowboys out in space with interstellar capability out there attacking and perhaps colonizing other naive planets. On the other hand, they may actually be interested in helping us. Well, that's the picture I get. That these people, although sometimes they're misinterpreted and sometimes some of them are not so good, on the whole, are really interested in helping us evolve into a new civilization that can join their ranks. Now, if indeed there are people in our various government agencies who want us, who have a fearful reaction, they have many ways of promoting that idea, and Dr. Boylan has described one of them. And I've come across some cases in which some kind of a fake incidents take place, and they're given a very, very bad impression of what ET visitation is like. And I think there is one group that's particularly active in doing this. And I have a few people, several people who had experiences with them. And they seem to have one of their most important factors, one of the most important jobs is to give a bad impression of all of the other ETs. And by promoting this sort of thing, to give a bad impression of the whole idea of ET contact. Well, we may have a choice. We have some people, some extraterrestrial people out there that are really able and I believe willing to help us. But we have a lot of denial to get over. One of the denials is that we can continue forever on a path of doubling our population every 15 or some countries to 80 years in other countries, maybe 30 years on average. You take a piece of paper, you fold it once, you fold it twice, everything is easy. Fold it 3 times, fold it 4 times. And at some point, any sheet of paper you have, you cannot fold it again. We are at that point in our population on Earth. We're not going to be able to fold the paper one more time. That's a very serious problem. We're seeing parts of it in Somalia right now. This is something that they are concerned about, and we should be also. There are all kinds of areas in which there are dreadful weapons being developed. And we need to take those under control and create a better civilization here on Earth. We need to take crime under control. And they certainly would be people who first to agree to that. One of my conversations with one of the ETs, and I have lots of those just like Giles does, said, do you have any crime in your society? Oh yes, she said, we had a criminal once. 5,000 years ago, we learned about him in school. Giles and other people have reflected on the fact that they don't seem to have emotions. Well, they do. Some of them don't. Many of them do. Some of them have emotions to the point where they get very peeved at me. And some of them show such a fantastic and marvelous love that they can even love me, right? That's like, that seems incredible to some people. So here you have this vast group, very large group of people, most of whom have been around for a long, long time, most of whom have done all of their physical exams long ago. There are a few remnants, like the cattle mutilators, who are trying to learn biology from scratch. They're not willing to listen to the others. They got their own ego. They got to do it themselves. And if you mix in and you realize, as a psychologist here too, how many people have fantasies and how people have fears, how many people have memories of childhood abuse, you know, there's an absolute explanation just right in our own human psyche for many of the things, the bad things that you've heard about. But let's get beyond that. Let's see what we can learn from other civilizations. They have existed for 100,000 or a million years, or even 2,000 or 1,000 or 50,000 years. They have had to learn how to live at some kind of peace with their environment. They've had to learn how to get along with each other so they don't have interminable wars. They've learned a lot of things that we need to learn. We need to pay attention to that. And we're not going to learn anything from people we think of as enemies. Some of them are enemies, right? But the vast majority, in my experience, are really trying to help. And part of the real problem is our denial and our unwillingness to actually listen to information that should be extraordinarily important to us. That's the big problem we have. We don't want to know, for instance, how population has to be limited. We think that we can have all the babies we want, treat them as badly as we want to, have 20 children, you know, some of them dead, and at the same time have all of the freedoms that we want. We have to make some choices, and they're very heavy choices, and we need to think about that. We need to see what kind of information we can get.
Thank you, Dr. Harter.
I guess I'll do this question to Dr. Turner. I'd like you to go a little bit more into the basis for screen memories representing deception.
What is it about that statement you don't understand?
It's not what I don't understand. The basic, well, I guess what I don't understand is what is deceptive about a screen memory?
It's not the truth. We, for instance, have, and you know, and other people have reported on cases where the onset of an encounter, which I choose to call an abduction since it's unwilling, begins with seeing perhaps a 3-foot-tall owl in the window. All right, and this is the conscious memory the person has, and there's missing time after that, and then perhaps later under hypnosis or with spontaneous recall, the owl was not an owl. It was an alien. That is deceptive. The owl is a deceptive screen. That's at a simple level what I'm talking about it in one instance. It's not true that there was an owl in the window. I'm really concerned with truth as close as we can determine it to be, and when you have something that distorts or screens the truth of a detail in an experience, then I consider that a deception.
Do a follow-up question?
Oh, yes, certainly a counter question is appropriate, of course.
Yeah. Following this a little bit, let me share an experience last night and see how well it fits the definition. When one of the experiences and I were doing a reconnaissance of Area 51, we had occasion to go past the little alien at Rachel. And I thought it was going to be well lit and would be easy to spot in the dark desert, but that did not turn out to be the case. The proprietors had turned off the light, and I was going by at about, well, let's say, slightly over 55 miles an hour. That may be close to a deception. At any rate, this enormous white rabbit about the size of a German Shepherd hops across the road, and I braked for it, obviously, not wanting to destroy wildlife or my car. As I braked, I noticed this building over there and saw the familiar marquee and said, whoops, that's the Little Alien. The Little Alien Restaurant, a rather famous place where the flyboys from Area 51 go to drink and etc. So this rabbit, I have reason to believe from work with others, peeling back screen memories, may have been something other than a rabbit. My eyes were deceived. It looked like a rabbit. I saw no evidence of it, but frankly, I think they've got an excellent sense of humor, and they did me a favor. Otherwise, I would have shot 5 miles over, been up to Hancock Summit, say, shoot, we missed that. It's getting late. I don't want to turn back. We would have missed Little Alien. So,
well, can I give a more in-depth answer then, for instance, about a different kind of screen memory that may seem deceptive but harmless? In one case, a 10-year-old boy and his 56-year-old grandmother were abducted, and after they were given the green liquid, the grandmother was placed on an inclining table and restrained, and a reptilian was in, there were other kinds there too, but a reptilian alien was involved and approached her and began to try to copulate with her. She fought this very strongly and said no, she had never had sex with anyone but her husband, she never would, and he was dead, had been dead 6 years. The reptilian being backed away from the woman, exited the room momentarily. When he returned, there was her dead husband. And the dead husband was brought up to her to have sex with her. She was then in the altered state that the green liquid seemed to have produced, and she accepted him initially. Before logic fought back through this altered state she was put into, until she could realize it could not be her husband because he had indeed been dead for 6 years. So again, a screen or deceptive device was used to gain what they wanted from her, which was the sex act. And since she was strong enough to fight even under the kind of duress she was put under against the reptilian, they deceived her initially into thinking therefore she was having sex with the husband, because that's who she said the only person she would have sex with would be.
Dr. Fiore.
Well, we can ask questions of the different panel members?
Yes.
Or just
yes.
one question each?
You may ask a question of anyone that you wish, or if you feel that you want to make a comment on the original question, you may.
Okay. I wanted to ask Dr. Turner if any of the people had, whether you construed it as screen memories or not, did they ever report a pleasant experience? or a good experience, or anything that would be what we could consider uplifting?
Yes, many people have reports of what they consider positive or uplifting, or at least non-intrusive or non-painful experiences. Some of them seem very objective, simply an examination that's not painful, and then they're let go. Others have experiences like one woman who was brought before an auditorium full of aliens and was brought to a podium where a book of some sort was placed on the podium, and she was told to read from this book to the audience, and she looked down at these blue figures that she couldn't read, and then was told if she would put her hand on each figure she would be able to get a message from it. And as she did this, she got spiritually uplifting or morally uplifting information, which she then proceeded to tell the audience, and she thought that was a very wonderful experience. She was in the presence of a tall humanoid figure with dark black hair with a little widow's peak point. He had on a robe and a crown, and she was very awestruck by the majesty of this man they called the Father. And that was under hypnosis, but under deeper hypnosis, since after this was over, she was in a terrified, crying, panicked, abandoned state. The hypnotist took her right back to before she was returned to her car and said, "What has caused your emotions to be this traumatic?" And she recalled something quite different from this spiritually uplifting event in which she had been suspended naked before this group of beings in a light bar of some sort, and was probed and prodded and used as some sort of biological example, and was praying to Jesus, whom she had great faith in, to make this stop because they were penetrating her. And when Jesus, make this stop, and of course it didn't stop. So when she was returned to the car, she was having the emotional reaction to her God having abandoned her, to having been raped or having been publicly displayed. And that first memory she had had with the being in the robe and crown and reading the spiritual book really seemed to have been some sort of palliative.
Okay, I would like to ask the question again, but in a different way. Have any of your people reported a positive experience that has not proved to be negative?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to just comment that in giving this talk to many audiences, people have come up afterward who have said to me, you know, you have emphasized the negative. And of course, I'm a psychologist, so people generally see me for problems. But that I have had experiences with ETs throughout my life, and it's been the most beautiful thing in my life. And I mean, I remember one woman, and she obviously she seemed like an intact person. She was a very creative artist. My next question is for Dr. Harter. You had mentioned...
Edith, we'll come around to you for the next one.
Oh, one question per panel member.
Right.
Oh, that's what I was asking. Okay.
We'll come back around.
Okay.
Okay, Carla?
Yes, and I think I'd like to ask Dr. Boylan, what trustworthy criteria do you use to determine when a person's hypnotist has been leading or has a bias before they go into it, as opposed to one who has an objective, non-leading approach? How do you judge that? Is it by the results of the person's testimony or by some other form?
Well, that would be by the evidence of their style. Best evidence would be transcripts, if available, of the way they ask the question, load the question, shape the question.
Have you got examples?
Plus any pre-talk. The other avenue of distortion can be the mental set of the investigator that the investigator either puts forward to the subject before he or she hypnotizes them, or whose reputation and writings are so well known that the person coming in knows very well the mental set of the investigator, and we know the influence of expectation on people under hypnosis.
Do you exempt yourself from that?
Do I exempt myself from that?
Exempt yourself from having a mindset before you go in, or having a known point of view before you deal with a person?
Well, I've not been very well known, so I don't have the reputation problem. The mindset, I make great pains not to give people, because I'm trying to do solid research and not give anybody an indication of my point of view, that we're just here to find out the facts. And in my experience, the facts tend to speak for themselves when a person gets all of them.
I'd like to point out that not only screen memories are something that can be induced from other places, but from people here on Earth. I was talking to a very well-known, not terribly well-known, person who reported a UFO experience on the East Coast. And in hypnosis session, I said, well, what do they look like? Oh, they're one of the little grays, she said. And then I used a technique that's familiar to psychologists in asking her what did her eyes see? What was her primary sensory impression? What did she really see with her eyes, not what she remembered? Oh, they're not gray. And they're not 3.5 feet tall. They look this, they look that. And pretty soon it became evident to me that she was describing blue eye, a group that I'm fairly familiar with. So she had brought into her hypnotics regression, even the one that I was conducting, a picture in her mind that she had confabulated with what had actually been going on. Now, all kinds of people bring all kinds of fears, angers, frustrations, early childhood trauma, all kinds of things to a hypnotic session. And it's so easy for them to confabulate those things with what's going on that it's not necessarily of any extraterrestrial origin, because it's happening later, considerably later. Now, I'm glad that Dr. Turner brought up the reptilians. It's the same people that I know about or familiar with. I have many people who have told me, some of them from first-hand experience, that this is the very group that Dr. Boylan has been investigating and looking into, that have had some kind of collaborative interest with the U.S. government. This seems pretty sinister, and many people won't believe that. And I'm not sure whether I believe it at all. But that is the group. That is the group that's been associated with the Area 51 government operation. Not necessarily very good people at all.
Okay, your question, Jim? You're up for a question.
I've used up my time here on the questions, so I just commented rather than asking the question.
All right, but you're allowed to comment on the prior question and still ask.
I'll pass it. Focus on Giles.
I'd like to address this to really all three of the panel and maybe giving me a show of hands on this. I would like to start out, though, by actually retracting what I said about a while ago, them having non-emotions. I was talking to Dr. Harter about that. Seemingly so many of them do not have emotions to start with, and seemingly that's what they want to contact and watch us for. They seem to have a beautiful experience of learning these emotions from us, again, because they feel that they have lost something. I had one woman come out of hypnosis the other day, making mental contact and whatever, and she had the most beautiful, sweet smile on her face I think I've ever witnessed on a human being. She turned around to me and said, I have never felt such love emanating from a human being in my life. But like a couple of these ladies, I haven't experienced so much of this negative stuff. I know it exists, and I'm sure it does, and I'm glad I don't experience this. I look too much to the negative side, to the spiritual side of it. Maybe I have got a mindset. But I state this several times, if I have a mindset and I've been accused of leading questions, and I plead guilty. But when I ask these aliens, if I do ask them a leading question, they will not let me lead them nowhere. When I'm wrong, they just tell me flat, that ain't it. They will not let me lead them nowhere, or even if they try to. So it really doesn't matter. What I found out, my basic question is, I'd like to address it to all three, see how many, if any, has experienced this. I've been told many times that there's something up there like an interplanetary council. Anyone coming into this atmosphere, solar system, whatever, they have to be cleared by the interplanetary council, and they themselves tell me that they try to keep negative ones out of here. They say their own selves that they know that they are not 100% accurate themselves, and they do get through sometimes. But my main question to all three and Dr. Harter, have y'all experienced this in a planetary council thing?
Have we experienced it or have we been told about it?
Both, or either. I told about it.
The number 57, I didn't say anything about until about 3 years ago, but I had heard it from a number of independent people who were, in a sense, speaking for some extraterrestrial information, who didn't know each other. And when it got past 3, I decided there was some, and that other people had told me this number. I decided there was some validity to the 57. It really doesn't matter that much, though. What's interesting is that it's such a large number. Whether it's 57 or 87 or 27, it's a very large number. And it represents a tremendous pool from which a lot of different people. And in addition to that, there are about 17 groups that have gotten so far that they don't even use spacecraft anymore. That's very hard to believe so for some people. And then there are scores of people who are even below that, who are not even, who are not members of the Federation, and they're here too. And in a sense, there's a way, well, it's, as long as they don't do too many really bad things to humans, they have their say too. I think some people that I know are trying to make some kind of appeal to have some Federation action taken against some of the worst of these things that are happening. And they may be successful, I hope so.
We have cases that have been told about this, but being told is no sign that it's true. Even though they've been told, several people unrelated have been told the same things. You can be told a lot of things, that doesn't mean they're true.
I'm writing a 4th book now. It's called Opening the Closed Door. And one of the cases in that will be of a person who saw me, a scientist with syntax, who surprisingly found a past life in which he was an alien coming to the planet Earth in its early stages in order to educate people. And even though he may not have been part of this confederation, I didn't ask that question. We were just doing a regression. He was obviously on a mission here of teaching the primitive people ways of bettering their civilization. He was obviously a very good person in that civilization. It's a fascinating account. I hope my readers find it fascinating, but if there is a confederation, it would honestly be part of it because his motives were the highest, and the whole society's motives were the highest.
In my research, I don't have any information about a confederation. Doesn't mean it exists or doesn't exist, just that no one has reported it as such as a implied governmental or other compact. The closest I've heard to that is that certain extraterrestrials have informed the person they were communicating with that there is a coordination of effort among a number of races in the work of making their presence known on Earth. So coordination is the most I can speak to that.
Richard, your question.
This will one be for Dr. Fiore. I'd like to ask you if, I think you alluded to this, but maybe go into it a little bit more. I think your collected kind of model case had to do with the 3.5 foot tall, gray-skinned individual. Could you say a bit more about the variety of races that you've encountered, if there have been more?
All right. First of all, I'd like to say that you realize, of course, that I'm a clinician, about 95% of researcher, 5%. So that if something just happens to come out fine, I don't ask questions about it because we're working against the clock and we're trying to heal the problem. But in the course of doing this work, the most common are the grays. There is usually a taller being in the ship. That being has not been described not in the ship. In other words, it's always within the ship itself. who is supervising matters, who seems to be much more human. Then there are some who are completely and totally human. In other words, they're just as human as you are, and indistinguishable. And my guess, and it's only a guess, is that this person has been created by the male and the female eggs, put together and then brought up in their culture. Then there are the reptilian ones. Then there are blue ones, blue beings. And I don't have much more of a description except they are blue. And then there's actually, this may be described by the experiencer that I brought, a black one. And it was not a Negro race, but a black one. And let's see what else. That's about it. I haven't gotten into the Nordic ones. I've had, of course I read about that, but I haven't had that come up in my practice.
Edith, your question?
I'm going to pass on the question.
Okay. Dr. Turner?
Yes, I'd like to follow up on this question. And I wanted to ask Dr. Boylan and also Dr. Harter the same sort of question. What variety of species are you having reported? And are we perhaps talking about the tall one in charge of the ship being the one that so many people call insectoid or in its physical appearance? And have any of you encountered the tall, completely human-looking, dark, widow-peaked beings?
I'm a little flat-footed here. I'm going to have to do this in memory. I always have meant to collect all the descriptions and catalog by racial type, but a lot of time pressure. So as good as memory serves, I'll have to do here. First of all, I think gray should be eliminated as a term. I think it leads to confusion because I have heard described 3.5 to 4 foot tall grays, 5 to 6 foot tall, 7 to 8 foot tall. Heard of people with mushroom white skin and grayish tones, sepia brown, and I think it may be an artifact of lighting and background as to whether these are all different skin colors or variations on a basic color. Eye configurations, the large black almond up, the large black almond straight horizontal wraparound, ovoid black eyes, cat slit eyes, yellow, pupil slit-like, praying mantis type figures, not the literal bug, but a very thin, kind of characteristically posed figure that particular analogy leads to mind for more than a few experiencers. I've run across the black-skinned individual who in other ways may resemble the so-called gray to a degree. What some people choose to call reptoids, which run a range of folks with a kind of greenish-white, fine scaly quality to skin. Facial features tend to come down a bit with more of a, I wouldn't say a snout, but more of a protrusion out from the face than the classical gray with 2 nostril holes in the slit. Humanoid types, but in almost, I've never run across a Nordic that I believed. I believe Nordics may well represent a cloak memory. I could be wrong on that, but the few white Anglo-Saxon, I don't know if they're Protestants, but that I run across, I asked the person, now, I want you to really notice detail here. I want you to peer intently at that person and tell me exactly what you notice. I hope that's relatively non-leading. And in every case, it penetrated through to a so-called gray or some other extraterrestrial figure. I can't tell you if Nordics don't exist, or as Edith is talking about, perhaps some folks that would pass, in the back of an alley of a bar at 2 in the morning for a human, but I have not particularly run across carbon copy humans that survive the penetration stare test. Cloaking does go on. I think calling it deception is an interpretation of motive. In my experience, I've seen the cloaking go for purposes of humanity. Little kids were shown an angel or a Jesus figure, and later on they could penetrate through to the true nature of the being when they were under hypnosis in a supportive setting. People have seen a gray, and upon closer examination it turned out to be a reptoid, more like figure, so that now that we're getting a little sophisticated, some of the extraterrestrials figure, well, you'll believe a gray. Can I sell you a gray? You know, actually, their appearance is a little more bizarre, and they want to let you down the primrose path gradually. So those are the variations that come to mind right off the top.
Do you mind if I just answer your question, even though you did direct it? I just remembered two more things. In my book, in one of the chapters, the person who looked like a gray, when they went into a certain chamber, they moved through kind of like a suit that just stayed. In other words, they slipped into this tight-fitting suit. And the eyes were really goggles to protect them from light. And the gray was just a very, very tight, practically like skin-like bodysuit, but underneath they had kind of like a crinkly brown skin, so I just remembered that. Also, when you mentioned praying mantis, a lot of people do see praying mantises. And another thing that happens is I see it as not a screen memory imposed upon the person by the aliens, but by our own defense mechanisms. This is something we learned about in psychology, that, for instance, and I see it all the time, like the sexual abuse, it may be a stranger who has done it, and then upon closer examination, it's a family member. That's just a defense mechanism of the mind. This automatically is the screen memory like the owl. So I don't think, we don't know whether that's coming from the aliens or from their own mind. But anyway, I'd just like to conclude at this point.
I'll just add a few things to which is Dr. Boylan's description. There are I have an alphabetical list. There's the W group, the A, B, C's, there's the F's, the I's, the H's, and we go by how many fingers they have. That's very, because on people when you have to count, the people have just kind of like a mitt. So the people have 6 fingers on each hand, 6 fingers on each foot. They're really not feet, they're just 2 extra hands. And they float, so they don't have to stand on anything. And when they bring all 24 of those fingers to work, and the fingers not only fold this way, but they fold the other way too. A fantastic ability to do surgery. That's a group that are not even based on water as a fluid system. They're based on gases. I think that there's some really fantastic possibilities out there. And then there's another group, we call them the T group. They don't have hands, eyes, ears, or any sensory input except psychic. That's their only input to the outside world is parapsychological.
Are they the balls of light?
That's another group that appear to be balls of light, and they don't even have a physical body that's visible. And there are about 17 of those, and appear in different places. So you can see the enormous variety. Given, say, 100 or 1 billion years of evolution, could be achieved.
Well, they don't even need that evolution, because when someone dies in this world, sometimes they are seen as a ball of light afterward. They bounce around the room, or they present themselves as a ball of light, and their personality. And the person who sees it usually knows that that's their mother or whoever.
Giles, did you want to comment on the question just a touch?
Yes, I wanted to make it more is asking a question, I guess, to the whole group. I find so many of these people lately that fit in the category, easiest I know how to explain it, is most everybody here has probably read Ruth Montgomery's book, Walk-Ins. Of course, like I was speaking to Wendell Stevens and Lee Bob here last night, and this book come out, seemingly Walk-Ins got real popular, and we find a lot of them. But Walk-Ins basically were Ruth Montgomery, I think, was a spirit type situation, but it also fit into the alien field, and of all things, right out there in the hall last night. Everything was quiet. There was only 2 or 3 people out there. Got to talking to a girl, and everything was quiet, and I hypnotized her right behind the book counter where I was selling the books. She's fitting this field of what I call walk-ins. In a way, they're alien beings. Seemingly, they have been altered genetically in the womb. Of course, they were born in normal fashion. Most of them feel that they're out of place. They don't feel close to their parents like a lot of people do. They don't feel close to the brothers and sisters. They feel as if they don't belong on this planet. They can't wait to get away from it. They feel total misfits. And on and on and on. We can talk about this. This girl related this last night right out in the hall out there under hypnosis. How many of y'all are running across this same situation, may I ask? All right, Dr. Harter, you
I have quite a few people who feel that way. Of course, if you look at some of the daytime soaps and some of the nighttime violence on television and a few other things that go on in this earth, even a perfectly normal human being could feel that this would be the right place for him to be. So if you can imagine a more spiritually minded, perhaps advanced intellectual alien having visited here, maybe as a volunteer, might reflect some of those same attitudes.
In my book, the case that has stirred up the greatest interest from readers and people like that, readers and people who talk to me about it, is the case of Dan. And he was a captain of a space cruiser and retired to the Earth, and he zapped the original inhabitant out of the body just took over when the person was a child. And now he's in that body, and he's a grown man, of course. And he was a grown man coming in, but he was in his child's body. I know Ruth Montgomery personally, and I'm very familiar with the concept of walk-in. And most people don't have a clear understanding, so just in case the audience has not read her book, a walk-in is a highly developed being who wants to come back to the Earth plane in order to carry out some mission or to make a contribution. They don't want to have to go through infanthood and babyhood anymore. And they want to skip those years because when they want to contribute has an urgency about it. So therefore, they make the 2 souls, the incoming one and the outgoing one, make an agreement that they will switch. Maybe the person who's in the body wants to commit suicide or is dying or something of that sort, but the body can be resuscitated, so to speak. So they make it, it's a mutual agreement. In other words, it's unlike the case of Dan, where he just zapped the other person out. But they don't go through, according to Ruth Montgomery, and who defined this term, they don't go through the infanthood and babyhood, so that may be a completely different thing. And I did find that when her book came out, almost all kinds of people came in to see me feeling that they were walking, because this is a rather kind of glorious thing to be such a highly evolved being that you've got a great contribution. And these people did not fit that description because they were in very bad shape. Usually when the walking came in, they would make an order of a life that was a big mess if the person were committing suicide, for example.
Like they had one thing to this. I went to lead a whole life expo, and there was a nice little lady on the panel there. She was supposedly, I'm sure was, Ruth Montgomery's original walk-in. She had a big part on the panel. And as I understand it, it's stated in the book by Ruth Montgomery, I haven't read it, that really she didn't write it, somebody wrote it for her. Well, this young lady that was her original walk-in, as I understand it, was the ghostwriter also of this book for Ruth Montgomery and her original walk-in. And we met at a meeting and had a lot in common, got to do extensive talking, and wound up back with her friend at the dormitory they were staying in, and I hypnotized her and found out that it wasn't just the walk-in, but she went into this other phase of it as also being an alien.
I've not run across what I understand to be classic walk-ins in my research. I have a couple things I could say that may be what people are calling walk-ins. one of which is a number of experiencers are reporting an extraordinary sense of not only kinship, but in the bonding sense, but kinship literally with extraterrestrials in the sense of, where these people live is my real home, or perhaps ancestral home. Not that the extraterrestrials are their biological parents, but way back. And I want to really underline this 3 times, very tentatively beginning to move to the position that we as a species represent some biological engineering a while ago by extraterrestrials, and that therefore there may be even a bit of genetic memory represented and enhanced and built upon by the repeat visits now by these extraterrestrials saying, don't you get it? I hear that time and time again. Don't you get it that, why you have this feeling of recognition of us, They don't want to lead the question too much, but it generally boils down to a sense of implied kinship or stated kinship. There is one case where, while I was doing regression to retrieve an abduction or encounter experience, the person spontaneously popped into a past life memory. I don't know quite what to make out of that yet. I'm not a real large past life person. Jury's out on that for me evidentiarily so far. But no classic walk-ins. And the follow-up would be to Dr. Turner. I think when I was rattling on, I forgot to answer your central question about the figure in the back. And may I ask, on the left in the back or on the right? The taller figure that tends to stand to the back of the examining table with the classic ray abduction. Is there a side that the figure tends to show up more on?
I have to look back and see if there were one side more than that.
Well, in my experience, it tends to be the person's left. I could be wrong, or not necessarily always the case. What is often there is either a very tall so-called ray, taller by a good foot or two than the rest of the folks, or another frequent occurrence is a hooded figure who is wearing a robe with a hood, often the face in shadows, so that the person cannot accurately describe the facial features of the figure, to the extent that people have seen the person turn halfway into the light. They've reported sort of either a tall gray or in 1 or 2 cases a reptoid, I believe.
We've had the hooded figures, I'm glad you brought them.
Dr. Turner, did you want to comment on the walk-in question?
Well, I wanted to comment on something that he said. I don't know if I should wait till it's my turn to ask a question, but it brings to mind that if you talked about moving tentatively toward the idea that we may be a product of some genetic work. I think this turns up a lot. And my thinking on this has come from those who said if we are their product, therefore they have the right to do really with us what they will. We belong to them, they created us. And I sort of think about that in children and parent terms here in the human relationship. Yes, the mother and father create the baby, but that does not give them the right to do whatever they want to with that child. The child does reach a point of emancipation and has a sovereign right to certain respect and limits as well. And if we are their genetic creation, I certainly think we may have reached a point where we are 21 now and no longer need parental intrusion without at least asking.
Okay, I think we left off questions with Dr. Harter.
I want to make a short comment and then I'll ask a question, Dr. Boylan. I think it's important to distinguish people's feelings that there's a unitary, there's a kind of we're hoping getting over the idea that there's just one group out there and that they're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing this, the other thing. And so to comment further on what this means philosophically, I think is amiss. But I have a question for Dr. Boylan. How many of your people that you talk to, and maybe Giles also, and perhaps Dr. Fiore, actually bring back stories or messages of what the ETs think that the humans should be doing to advance our own civilization, advance our own understanding of ourselves, and perhaps our own spirituality. How many of your people bring back things of that sort from their encounters?
Glad you asked that question. I tried to digest in my publication on 2 pages the messages that have been gotten. In August, I asked this circle of experiencers that I meet with to each go around the room and present what they had gotten from the communications, almost invariably telepathic, with the extraterrestrials they had dealt with. And if you want the nuts and bolts, you can read it in the publication. I'll just give you 2 or 3 excerpts, and that'll have to serve for some more. I got a feeling of wanting to be bonded with the ETs. I found myself missing them. When I was with them, I had a sense of peace, love. You become part of the principal ET individual dealing with you. He becomes your counterpart. Another person said, there will be profound changes in the next 10 years. Even limited nuclear war is possible, but I feel no panic. I get the feeling it will evolve into peace and harmony. The ETs are here teaching me. I must be more trusting, be open, be ready to let go. Another person talked about just saying very simply, some other 3. They communicated that it's important to steer the children in the right direction. These are just a few of the kind of messages. I would say that with thorough debriefing of the individual, a good 3/4 seem to come back with a sense of message, and some of the others have a vague sense of mission, which I suspect when it gets unfolded will represent a kind of message as well.
All right, I'll address that's a very easy one, Dr. Harter. I find this almost weekly, continually, all the time, them wanting to see us perfect our ways, more loving, more spiritual. In fact, I was asked Bob, there's a poem here that's in the book that I want to read after Bob that really answers this beyond all I can sit here and say. So I'll bow out. I'll read this little later. Thank you.
Don't you want to read it now?
No, he wants to close with it.
Whatever.
You can close with it.
All right.
Edith, you want to?
I'll respond to that. Sometimes people are given instructions to meditate, to be more involved with ecology, and that sort of thing. Things that we've already discussed.
Dr. Turner, would you like to comment on the message being given?
Yes, many of the people in the cases that we've collected have been told they have a mission or a job or a task they're going to have to perform, and the time limit does vary somewhat, so it makes it very hard to know what aspect it is to believe, but many have been told by 1993 they will be switched on to do their jobs. They won't have a choice about it. They will be where they're supposed to be, and they will do what they're supposed to do, not to worry about it, but they won't tell them what the job is going to be. Also, several cases have been told that their mission, or that there is going to be a rescue, if you will, and I really use that term sarcastically, of a certain number of humans that will be removed either from this planet to another planet or to some facility in order for the Earth to be purged and cleansed. And I think that's a real nice way to put it, but they're talking about destroying it, basically, what we have on it. For whatever reason, we've ruined it, or there's too many of us for them to deal with, or whatever the situation is. And they vary from person to person. Some have been told that they'll rescue 12,000. Some have been told they'll rescue 1.3 million. It really does vary, so it's hard to know what to believe about that. But they do give these numbers, specific numbers of people who will be rescued. And then we will either be returned to the planet once it's all put back together, or we'll be put on some other kind of planet. And several have been told that they're growing new bodies for us. Those sorts of messages.
Dr. Fiore, your question?
Okay. I'd like to preface my question with a comment. I've been doing this work since about 1975, and I have only found about 5 cases of people who have been forced to have intercourse. And I'm just going back into my memory. 3 men and 2 women that come to mind in all these years. And as I said, I've worked with probably about 400 people. And I feel like I've done a pretty in-depth analysis of their experience. It hasn't been researched, but they've gotten over their problems, and I feel like we've gone from A to Z with it. My question would be, I'd like to ask every other member, the other 4, starting with you, Giles, what is the incidence of sexual abuse that you have come across in your years of working with these people?
That has been perpetrated by the aliens?
Yes, in other words, that the aliens have forced the man or the woman or the child to have sex.
I find that very little, and again, like Dr. Harter said, because I guess I've got too much of a mindset that I look for the better things, I guess, and seemingly I receive them. I do find not too many sexual things. I have found one lady that had numerous ones with the reptilian race, I believe one of you mentioned a while ago. And she went into detail of that. According to her, she had 3 children in outer space. Give the ages of them. I forgot the ages now. One was 4, 1, 6, and 1, 7, I think. She had been picked up and shown these children to her, supposedly, according to her. And there was one particular reptilian that she had numerous intercourses with, and I don't mean to act this way, and she was real impressed. Didn't even cause conflict between her and her boyfriend. I found not so much of the intercourses, but numerous times where they've been picked up and shown the fetuses aboard ship. I guess where there had been intercourses with others. In fact, I've had even related to even spaceships full of fetuses, but not too many intercourses, actually.
I want to speak to this topic because it's very emotionally charged, and I think it's an area of what my research tells me is large misinformation. The number of sexual intercourse cases I've run across is 0. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't heard about sex in this context, but let me tell you what I've actually found. The extraterrestrials are very adept psychologically and telepathically in inducing mental visualizations when they wish to for various purposes. Some of the, may I be so bold as to say, low-lifers, although they're still technologically ahead of us, are still doing ovum and sperm harvesting from time to time, but that's a very tiny percentage of the cases I've run across. The kind of blurred figures you hear out there, I find no corroboration for. What I have found is 2 things. One of which is that a visualization of a sexually appealing person, more likely human-looking than extraterrestrial, although I think one possibly might make a case of the latter, has been presented to the person so that they feel they're in the experience of either having sex with their girlfriend or something like that, boyfriend. And it isn't the extraterrestrial mounting them and having sex with them and passing the girlfriend or boyfriend off as him or herself, but a visualization designed to be stimulating so that sexual hormones rise, and apparently for extraterrestrial, breeding and breeding material extraction purposes makes a healthier specimen take. This arguably may be a manipulative kind of way of getting the result, but it does not represent mounted intercourse. In all cases, the methodology is similar to the way we do artificial insemination instruments and no personal body parts of alien inside. The other thing I've run across, and I think this really needs to get out in the clinical community too, I don't know how many therapists are here. I've run across repeated cases, and I think I'm starting to get that with colleagues, of people who for a long time have thought that they were the victim of incest because they remember somebody coming in their room at night, pulling back the bedclothes, and touching their body, including some very private places, and as best they could tell, it looked like Uncle Charlie or Dad or somebody. And upon revisiting the experience, it turns out two things. I'm not saying all cases, believe me, there's plenty of incest going on, it's terrible, and it needs to be acknowledged and treated. Let no distortion go forth on that. But there are some cases where this is a cloaked memory for an extraterrestrial encounter and palpation kind of scientific, medical, presumably investigative process. And so the extraterrestrial, in order not to frighten the person, took on the appearance of a familiar figure. The other aspect is that while a person may have remembered sexual penetration, when they are asked to notice exactly what's in there, is that a penis in there or not? No, it's too small for that. No, it's too short for that. And it's too metallic-like, it's not, in other words, a penis. So that is a misinterpretation of an experience. Now, these are kinds of highly charged sexual encounters that you can see if someone doesn't get highly skillful analysis of the experience. Can go off saying they're out here helping everybody they can get their hands on. I can't talk about anybody else's research. I've run across 0 cases of my own.
You assume that the penetration was technical rather than biological, and therefore there wasn't a sexual case. Do I understand you right on that?
I don't know quite what you mean. I don't make any assumptions. I let the people tell me what they see.
But you interpret what they tell you.
No, I'm telling you what they told me.
I think you did. I thought I heard you interpret that you had heard sexual material, but you considered 0 cases of sexual intercourse. So if you'd heard it...
I told you what the cases were. They were mistaken incest cases and eroticization visualizations for which there was no physical mounting and body penetration actuality to the visualization.
Okay. But the person felt it was a real experience. The result feeling was real. Right, okay. Yeah, we've had this as well. I agree that sometimes what seemed to have been a human incest episode, and I know of one in particular that's very telling, turned out not to be human at all. But I think we have to look, on the other hand, those who would say that the memories of sexual encounters in abductees stem from real sexual abuse or incest cases, and these are the mask for them, have to be thoroughly examined, that doesn't really hold up. There are a number of abductees who were sexually abused as children, just like there are non-abductees. But they remember the sexual abuse as well as the abductions. So it doesn't seem to be working as a screen. They have both sets of memories. We also have cases, and I don't know what you would make of this to make it a misinterpretation, where it's the mouth that is penetrated, not the genitals area. And when they get up close and personal and clear their vision and look closely and use the staring technique, they see what clearly appears to be an alien form of a penis. So we do have those cases as well.
I see a little interpretation going on here where a metallic object could be considered a penis in the case of Boylan's remarks. I think people do bring to some of their experiences, some of their own fantasies. I know there's a well-known case being circulated in other parts of the country of a man
who's drawn pictures of this alien beautiful lady who seduced him repeatedly and showed him on board a craft thousands of children that he had fathered. What a marvelous fantasy that is. And he was being seduced by this beautiful lady, and that's another fantasy, of course. And then when pictures that were being put on the screen were passed by a panel of people, I mean, I know some people who have fairly good access to the galactic records. They said there are no such creatures as that exist to our knowledge in the galaxy. And the human, the person, there was another anomaly there. So you just have to imagine that, look, if 1% or 5% of the population are sexually fascinated and fantasy prone at the same time, how easy it is to find them. Really, it's just surprising there aren't more, and there aren't more Geraldo type shows exploiting them. Joan Rivers can find all kinds of people like this with a drop of a hat. And maybe she'll get onto this and she'll have a heyday with our stuff too. But I want to get beyond, if I can, this preoccupation. Oh, by the way, let me answer the question about whether I have had people. Yes, there have been 2 people, 3 people who reported, and I do believe they had real sexual intercourse. That they really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. They weren't forced on them at all. And I have various explanations for that, which is to a certain extent hypothetical. But I haven't found anyone, with one exception, who believed that it was forced on them, and then when I looked into that more carefully, it was a confabulation of earthly scene. I've never heard of anybody having forced, and this is over 25 years, and maybe 20, 30, 40 people a year, and you'd think that if something like that came up, that I would have seen it. I've never seen a forced rape scene.
Okay, the last question now for the panel, to the panel. We'll start with Dr. Harter and work back this way so we can end Giles on this part.
Well, I do know, and in preference to my question, that people do get this sort of message of hope for the world. But I want to go further and say, have there been people who brought back pictures of what kind of things that we could be doing in terms of creating a better world here with our own earthly resources? They have any opinion about what we could do about ecology in more specific ways than just consciousness raising, or is that essentially what they're up to, consciousness raising? That's my question.
Okay. Carla, you want to take it first?
Just briefly, they have shown pictures of destroying the status quo physically so that we do have to start over. That's about all I can say they offered as a solution.
Dr. Fiore?
I really don't have an answer to that.
Information I have received from the experiencers suggests that the concerns about change, end times, cataclysm have to do with our destruction of the planet and our aggression against each other, not theirs. It's very obvious with their technology that they could conquer us anytime they felt like it, have not chosen to do so. But they are very concerned about what we're doing to our own planet. And I think they must have a sort of galactic Sierra Club attitude that it's a shame a planet's a terrible thing to waste.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. They have told us in more cases that what a beautiful planet here, what we've got, and the way we destroy it, how awful it is. And I guess this is basically conscious racism, so to speak. They can't understand our hate, our jealousies, our greeds, our wars. And again, we'll go back to the poem later. We'll bring this to surface. Thank you.
Carla, your question?
Yes, how many of you had cases in which the abductees have reported being taken not to a ship facility but to an underground facility?
Recently, there have been a couple of cases in California, only this past year, have I heard of this picture, and I have tried to establish whether it was a musty odor that these people were reporting, or whether it was just some screen memory for a room. I haven't really been sure about that. And there have been many suggestions that some of their hiding places are under the oceans, which would make a very good place to store things. You didn't want the U.S. Air Force to be bombing.
And going into my memory banks, I would say that I can't remember any case particularly, but just offhand, I'd say only just a few through the years, and nothing specific.
I believe that I've run across a couple of cases. The one that comes clearest to mind is a cave in a mountain, and the experiencer was taken there twice. Car and himself pulled up inside the saucer, and the whole shooting match inside the cave. The saucer opens up, he's extracted, car stays inside saucer. We even have a pretty good idea where the cave is when they say, see, I can try a lot, knocking on the door and seeing what happens. It's near Knights Ferry, California, but closer than that, I do not choose to be at this point.
Giles?
I know a lot of people don't believe in a lot of these challenge sessions. I do, and I'll be the first to admit you have to take it with a grain of salt. But yesterday in a challenge session right up in my room, Ricky Monroe and myself will be on stage here, the one we done, and it's talking about storing places. The alien went in and described in detail around the world where the basis was, underwater, etc., what sections they were, basically what they've done. And a question I've asked, I don't know how many thousands of questions, they say there's very few pictures of a cigar-shaped flying saucer. And I happened to think about this, why a cigar-shaped flying saucer? They told me exactly, without stuttering one bit, that this was their transport cargo machines. They wanted to move equipment, huge, just like our vans, our big planes. The cigar shapes was the transport of large, numerous stuff. And went on to what bases they was going to with these, and so much of this stuff, I take it with a grain of salt, but I got a secretary at home that transcribes this stuff. She's not into metaphysics, she's not into UFOs. And the only thing she cares about is a few bucks an hour she gets for the typewriter. She brings this stuff in and she plops it down on the desk sometimes, and she looks down at it. She says, this darn stuff just makes sense. And most of it really does, if you'll just try to not be biased and say it ain't so and analyze it. Such a large percent of it just does make sense. Thank you.
Dr. Turner, at this point, I want to put the question back to you, if I may. Your experience, what has been reported vis-a-vis underground facilities and people being abducted?
Yeah, we've had perhaps in the last 4 years, maybe 9 cases that have reported being taken into rather large underground facilities. And these are totally unrelated to each other. The cases do not know each other. They're often from different states or are widely diverse geographically. They've described almost identical details about the entrances, about the setup of what goes on in certain areas, and storage areas, processing areas, and so on. And these are coming from what I call virgin cases. They're not into ufology. They don't know John Lear or Jacques Vallée or Bud Hopkins or any of these names. They're not part of their background, so they're not getting this material apparently from an external source, but they're reporting very close similarities and details to these underground areas. And that's why I was interested in what other people were getting as well. And oftentimes they are reporting humans involved with aliens working in these facilities. No.
What was the closing question, Dr.?
Yes, if they were square cornered. Very often there are rooms that are human rooms with human doors and human desks within these, but the facilities seem to have been hewn out, so they're not overall square.
Dr. Fiore, your question?
I would like to ask all the other panelists about the shapes of the UFOs that the abductees are taken into. I will just say that there have been only two, and the one is the circular one that I found, and the other is a large triangular one like the ones that appeared over Belgium. And it's just seeing that the patient that relayed that told me that a week before that came out in Unsolved Mysteries, and she gave me the exact description with the three lights at each corner of the triangle and the red pulsing light underneath. It was really amazing. And then, of course, it was on Unsolved Mysteries later that week or the next week. So I'd be interested in hearing about that.
I think the literature is pretty complete with the different sizes and kinds.
No, I mean in terms of what the abductions are taking place.
Mostly people report just the immediate vicinity. I do remember the Travis Walton well-known case. I was taken up in a small craft, but anyone who's on a large craft wasn't very well published. I don't think, unless it was in his own book, he crossed a large hangar deck in which there were three smaller UFOs parked. To get to a still distant part, this must have been a huge craft. And that's one of the more remarkable accounts that come back.
Dr. Turner?
Honestly, very few report the external description of the craft. They may have seen a craft before an abduction, but they don't necessarily see themselves going up to that craft. There's normally a loss of continuity between the encounter and the room or facility where they're being examined, and many times it seems to be not on a craft, actually. Sometimes they're very messy. You hear about all the nice sterile white light and so on in the areas, and there are those that do turn up, but there's also some very messy, smelling, hurried, crowded areas with tons of equipment that we might call computerized equipment, just crowded and shoved into the areas. So it's a variety of places.
Dr. Boylan?
I've had a fair number of people, when I really have them slow down and go through the detail of the experience, who get a glimpse of the kind of craft they're going up into. The huge preponderance of cases, it's spherical, roughly in the 30 to 50 foot wide. I should say round, not necessarily spherical. Looking from the bottom up, you see round, 30 to 50 feet wide. From being inside, there's some assumptions that it's domed. In other words, close to the usual variety of plastic saucers. I don't know that I can pull right off of memory variety on that. So,
Thank you. Giles, the question as to types of craft?
Most of mine, like Dr. Ball, there is pretty much classical, being the round craft, 30 to 50 feet, but sometimes, like it's also mentioned, they don't see the craft, but sometimes seemingly they do take them aboard the smaller crafts on into the mothership, so to speak, and sometimes the people are just at awe. They're under hypnosis and they try to describe it and just say it's humongous, just something like that. Lord knows how big it is. There's one landed at Hastings, Florida one time several years ago, and it was reported by the main real estate agent in town there, and it's quite a thing of its day. Dr. Heineck and all of his staff come down and investigated it, landed in a field out there, and presumably it's a mothership that just came down and landed in plain view in an old field. The man took a Jeep out there proceeded to drive around it in plain view. Said he just had enough guts, he was going up there, and asked those folks what did they want. Took his 2 grown daughters with him. It was in a field, used to be roads that went up and down. Probably he couldn't go 2 or 3 miles an hour. Said it took him 15 minutes to drive around it. He went back and made a normal report on it. He was going to stop, and his daughters started crying and whatever, begging him not to go back home, so he took them back. He reported this craft. This is back a number of years ago at the little place of Hastings, Florida, and Dr. Heineck flew down there, got a helicopter, searched the area, and they really didn't find a whole lot. They found a little stem of something, particle of a limb or something that had something very slick on it, slicker than any oil or grease that we knew of. Didn't find anything, and supposedly as the tale was, Dr. Heineck went back to Chicago and got a whole carload of scientists and taking soil samples and all this. It was quite an endeavor. While they was gone, the thing come back and landed again. And this fellow that done all this reporting, like I said, he was the main real estate agent in town. He was head of the Masonic Lodge, and there got to be so much publicity about this thing that it's on his farm there, and he had his own little real estate development, and I got this in a slide presentation I showed back home. He decided to capitalize on the publicity of this thing, and he hung another sign under his real estate sign, says extraterrestrial landing site. I got a slide of it at home, and they still really didn't find anything. Some company done a little documentary on it. I interviewed and talked to one of the deputy sheriffs that worked the thing, and it's the first time that I'd come across. Apparently he had a little visit for the men in black. It's the first time I'd ever heard of them. This has been 15 years ago. I think I'm being told here in hush up. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Boylan, your question. And our first question.
My question's real simple, Dr. Turner. Could you answer your own question about the different types of aliens that you've seen?
That I've seen personally or that we've had reported?
You have reported in your research.
All right, we've had the gray beings that I really don't consider to be aliens, considering they're always under somebody else's control, so I don't know about those. The praying mantis type or insectoid type, which is tall and has the very slim arms, very slim body, and seems to be in charge quite often. Another tall type with round eyes, with a round mouth that at least one individual has been allowed to touch, and has very spongy interior surface rather than teeth, and deeply wrinkled skin, that's a grayish-brown color. Reptilian sorts that are robust, have a scaly type exterior ranging from green to muddy brown with clawed and webbed appendages and quite functional teeth. The ball of light figures that often use either verbal or telepathic communication, and they simply look like a basketball-sized light source. The human-looking blondes, but like Dr. Boylan said, many times, and we've had at least a couple of these cases penetrate enough with and without hypnosis to see that the blonde was a screen of some other sort of being that actually, in the one case the person had memory of without hypnosis, was rather bumpy and purpley and almost slick or wet-looking in reality, and this that had used the beautiful blonde image as a cover. The short gray, the very dark, black, slim figures that are often robed or hooded. And one that the person called Mr. Green Jeans because he saw it when he was a little boy and Captain Kangaroo was on, and it was about 2 or 3 feet tall and glowed almost neon green and floated. This is the best description we could get on that.
Thank you. Next question.
I was just curious from the panelists if there was, I was curious about some of the personal characteristics of a lot of the either abductees or contactees and so on. Dr. Turner had made a comment about that our planet, as a planet, we're 21 now, and that they can kind of leave us alone, that we are okay to our own devices. I'm just curious of the panelists up here, just to signify by raising your hand, are any of you currently smokers now? I was curious if any of the contactees or abductees, do they have what society is considering to be undesirable personal characteristics such as smoking or drinking and that type of thing?
Who are you addressing that question to?
Jim.
Generally speaking, a very heavy concern for health is a part of their life, sometimes taken even to extremes. You might remember the case of John Salter, who had an encounter, I think, 3 years ago, and who, after 1 year, more or less, getting used to the idea, completely stopped a very, very heavy tobacco habit. Apparently that had been something that had been put in his mind by what he believed to be an extraordinarily benevolent and caring group of people.
Would anyone else like to comment on that? Carla?
Yeah, we have people who smoke, people who drink, people who mess around, people who had drugs, people who have never had any of those, people who eat meat, people who don't. The only characteristic, I don't know why maybe that is an offensive characteristic to some of you, any one of those may be, but we don't have any one kind of personality or characteristic that seems to denote the abductee as being somehow different from the general population, except they do seem to be very intelligent and very morally benevolent.
My findings are in agreement with Dr. Turner's.
Interesting question. My research, I found trends. The starting contactee or experiencer tends to be your average cross-section of humanity. White, African American, Chicano, Asians, youngs, old, middle-aged, both sexes, all socioeconomic classes. There's not much of a discriminator there. In terms of lifestyle habits, we have a usual range of people who smoke, drink, etc. But what we notice seems to be happening over time as people kind of mellow with the experience and presumably are being influenced by either thinking about their previous experience or in many cases renewed contact, at least at the telepathic message level, that more and more of the group are moving away from tobacco, away from alcohol use, towards vegetarianism, towards either earth spirituality or Native American religion or something in that spectrum. So there does seem to be some lifestyle shifts that occur as a long-term consequence of contact.
The doctor's just about answered mine. Exception, they do seem to want to become more spiritual, and above all, they become more psychic, so many of them, and they are more health conscious, and basically, other than that, about what he finished saying.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, I'd like to ask all of you, a MUFON investigator in Massachusetts has encountered, and there may be others, well, cases of what he calls dual reference, in which experiences, as they call them up there, when they are on the ship, they slide into another identity or an expanded consciousness in which they identify with or recognize that they are themselves of that ship or of another group of so-called aliens, and that prompts me to wonder if we are not all fragmentary projections of a higher, or I don't want to at all say higher, but of a different, of a differently vibrating consciousness. But that really, well, I'd just like to know what, if you have found cases of dual reference.
Okay, let's start at the far end, Dr. Harter.
Yes, this is fairly frequent. If it were more prevalent, we hope that there wouldn't be as many problems as we have on Earth. But indeed, people do identify in the way you describe, and maybe perhaps in some way manifest a different personality. I don't believe, as some people do, that this represents some kind of being kicked out on the part of some other. I mean, after all, if an extraterrestrial wants to have some kind of a dual occupancy with you, it's only because he's a particularly altruistic and perhaps volunteer, because living on Earth is the dregs, right? They're not here for fun. But there are people who do have some kind of, it looks like a kind of a dual attitude. I'd like also to comment on the fact that there are some people who believe that they are extraterrestrials personally, right? Yeah, I know there are people who say that. If there were such a person who was a true extraterrestrial among you, the last thing you would hear would be him to say that. No, if anybody tells you he's an extraterrestrial, that's the very first thing he'll tell you that he's not. Okay.
I really meant that it's people who felt a different identity or
Yes,
a different awareness when they were there as opposed to here.
That's right.
Not
When they're there,
anything
perhaps.
like being here and saying,
Right.
oh, I'm an extraterrestrial. I don't mean anything like that.
It may be what you might call a latency, which is brought out under that circumstance.
Dr. Turner.
Yes, we've had some of those cases where they feel like they're part of the crew when they're up there, or for some reason they didn't remember it each time they go back. But one in particular case, 3 women were abducted in New Mexico a couple of years ago and taken to what they all 3 separately described as an underground facility. One was taken away and experienced the typical gynecological exam in a room near a laboratory area. The second person, under hypnosis, never got past screaming. And the third one remembered going in, walking over to an area, putting on a suit that matched the suits of the aliens there, sitting down at a computer-like machine, and said, I punched in my code and began working. So, and this was not something she thought before or after, and really has trouble accepting even now.
Dr. Fiore.
I've had a number of people who have had that experience where they feel that they're with their own kind, and they long to go home. There's a lot of that. In terms of percentages, I'd say about 5% maybe, just off the top.
Dr. Boylan.
As I understand the question, I don't think I could report that kind of altered state of consciousness with that nuance to it. I have found a number of times a couple other things that may be what you're talking about, or I'll just put it on the basis of what people I've dealt with have experienced. One of which is, as Dr. Fiore has said, a sense of kinship, more than quick friendship, but a sense of ancestral kinship. The other thing is people who have had a lot of earth trauma from fellow human beings have developed a readiness to move into an altered state of consciousness, out of body experience dissociated state, as you may wish to call it, and find themselves dissociated, looking over at themselves on the table, etc., because that's the way they've dealt with earth traumas, and that mechanism serves them well in this new setting. But as I understand you technically asked the question, I cannot confirm that.
Giles, your experiences?
I'll have to answer pretty much the same way they do. I've found multiple times they have felt that way, that they even become part of them. I got one man individual, supposedly he was aboard for 9 days, and supposedly it seems they was from a planet that the Mayan people was from, and they even taught him their language. And I know this sounds way out, but the big button, this thing under hypnosis now, sometimes this boy does speak what we think's Mayan. He speaks it fluently. I done one session where I had to scold him to get him out of Mayan and back into English, if that's what he is, and he writes him. Supposedly he was aboard in 9 days. This is kind of hard to overlook.
Next question.
I have a two-part question basically addressed to the whole panel. First of all, can any of y'all explain why UFO sightings come in rashes and why we have lows on them? And have y'all had any reports from my home state basically, which is Georgia, because where I come from, we are currently having sightings and by people every day and every night. Thank you.
Dr. Harter, do you want to start?
Yeah, perhaps they moved from to Georgia from Alabama, where you may recall the Fife sightings of about 3 years ago. I'm not sure whether that's some kind of an experiment to determine what a large number of sightings would do to the psychology of a local group of people. I mean, maybe they are very interested and concerned about what would happen should there be a more intense evidence of their actual physical presence. And they might take some place like Fife, Alabama, or Belgium, or some small place where they can have kind of a close observation of the effect. And that might be an explanation of what you're observing.
Dr. Turner?
I don't have any explanation.
I don't have any explanation that comes out of the experiences in my office, but I just have some hunches. And one would be that the activity is increasing year after year in different areas, and sometimes it subsides, but I think that we are being prepared. All you have to do is look at the contents of the movies and the documentaries, and you can see. It'd be interesting for someone to plot the frequency of movies that are related to UFO and aliens, and it's just increasing and increasing. And I think that it's very significant that E.T. was chosen twice to be shown on Thanksgiving because he had such a huge viewership. So I think that it's a way of getting us prepared. I mean, that's just my own personal guess. It doesn't come out of any kind of finding from my office.
With the people I've worked with, I do not have an explanation for the general flaps, like Belgium and other ones that have had high frequency. I do have one sense of purpose and frequency that is in the future, in the very near future, and that is the content of several people's communications received from extraterrestrials while during a close encounter. And that's that there will be increasing numbers of sightings and increasing visibility and increasing sort of in your eye kind of undeniable public kinds of sightings mounting in the months and year ahead as part of the conditioning for the open revelation of the extraterrestrials widely among us despite the government cover-up.
I agree with basically the above there. I believe for a number of years that the extraterrestrials, along with our government, is spoon-feeding us in a lot of different ways. Could take 2 hours on that. Like these contacts, I told somebody the other day that I deal with and hypnotize. They're coming out of the, so to speak, the woodwork now. I've had as 4 and 5 different ones a week, and I made the statement that I think it's being changed now from being spoon-fed, and I think there's a little small shovel being used instead.
Next question.
This is for Dr. Fiore. I was curious to know if an update on your case study of Dan, who was so anxious to get back on his battle, and whether or not his experience might be used to be, that he might be able to be, if you have any comment, if his experiences here might be useful in some sort of future time as a big operation or something like that.
I haven't seen Dan since I wrote that chapter. We talked on the phone about 6 months later. He was very, even though I had invited him into my office to do that work, because he was not a patient, he benefited therapeutically from uncovering those memories and felt much more at peace with himself. I have no idea as to his future use, but that's an interesting question. Everybody's curious about Dan. I think that he was the star of the hook.
Thank you.
Next question.
Okay, I have two related questions. Do any of you know any ways of protecting yourself or your family from abductions? And I think that's where the smoking question came from, because my wife had read somewhere that smoking can protect you. In fact, she took it back up for that particular reason. And the next question is, how can you question a child without traumatizing a child about what they may have? If you see some things in their life that makes you think something's happened, is there a way of safely questioning them to find out the truth?
I'll start by answering. I used to be a child psychologist when I first started my work, and that was my original training. I would think that just at home what you could do is, first of all, you just listen very carefully to what your children say, and without asking any leading questions, but just asking questions that would open the door for them to tell you more without any fear of being ridiculed or whatever. And then also you could have them draw. Just ask them to draw pictures of what they saw. And watch their doodles, because they may draw, or their drawings, they may draw pictures of ETs without you even asking. So I just think that that's a form of therapy, art therapy, and that can be very helpful to help them to master those emotions. So that would be the answer to the one about the children. As far as protecting yourself by smoking, tell your wife to stop smoking. She's killing herself by smoking, and she's not protecting herself at all, because a lot of my abductees were smokers. And also, by the way, I would like to add that after repeated abductions, they some of them have given up drugs and drinking too much and are cleaning up their act, so to speak. As far as how can you protect yourself, I'm sorry that I have to be negative about this. I know there is one lecturer who feels that you can use your free will and surround yourself with white light. I don't find that does any good. I'm sorry to report that. But my own feeling is that maybe in the rarest of cases, but as a general rule, and I would say I don't feel that, say, 95% of the people who would attempt to repel these experiences or repel the people or to prevent this from happening by using any kind of protective things, because people have prayed, and when they see the aliens, they start praying, and if they've had these experiences and they remember them, they pray to Jesus and Mary, and they don't get any protection. And so what this does, of course, is they feel God's letting them down, and so it just adds to the whole problem. But I don't know of any way that they can forestall to avoid this.
Go ahead, Rich. Well, to the first question about protection, I guess I'd ask why. It's not nice to answer a question with a question. And to follow up on that, it's sort of like a person trying to get some sleep, and Paul Revere is riding by and saying, "The red coat's coming, red coat's coming." He goes to the window and says, "Shut up, I'm trying to get some sleep." They're here, and they're here for a purpose, and overall, the purpose is very much worth paying attention to. So I have a little trouble getting very enthusiastic with the project of trying to ward them off. Some very high tech's been done, including motion detectors, infrared sensors, and they just simply switch that off if they want to come in. So the military intelligence highest tech stuff isn't worth squat. So I doubt that cigarette smoke is going to be much of an impediment. As to the kids, I've worked with a number of kids and experienced as kids too. It's not so much how do you tell them or shape them. The kid has the experience in the way that they have it already. All it needs is a respectful listening to, some eliciting of further detail. In most cases, I think hypnosis with very small children is not indicated. Other ways of evoking what the experience was, as Dr. Fiore so well said, the classic form of art expression. I found puppetry to work well. Kids can talk through the puppet stuff. They don't have to take ownership of personally. But the other kids will talk just about the little guys that come at night. And if you're matter of fact about it, kids take their psychological and emotional reaction from the parent cues. If you're screaming and ready to cut your wrist, the kid's going to be traumatized. If you say, well, that's interesting, and what happened next?
they're going to get matter of fact about it. I think that may be the most important thing to keep in mind about the kids.
Dr. Harter?
The paradox is that if you ask somebody who's a true friend and really respects you to leave, he probably will. If you find somebody who's not quite so friendly toward you, he may not hear you at all. So I would suggest that telling somebody to leave is probably counterproductive, or at least not very effective. But I will say that in many instances over a long period of time, I have been able to get into the person's communication with the extraterrestrials that they're familiar with, sometimes channeling, whatever you want to call it, and engage in a two-way conversation. And frequently, a misunderstanding has taken place that can be straightened out. I could give you many examples in which whatever seemed to be an intrusion or something else has been relieved by a rational discussion. Seems very strange to you, I'm sure. In which people's lives have been essentially improved by better understanding, and furthermore, some kind of insistence on the part of the extraterrestrials for a certain course of action has been deflected when they realize that it's not the best thing to happen. They'll actually listen, believe it or not, and they're very rational people.
Well, for those of you who know the answer to why try to get them to stop, I will offer at least one possibility. Neanderthals that we are, we don't like this business maybe, and one thing that's worked to stop a particular encounter when it's the gray beings, even though you may be immobilized physically, is to blast mentally great anger or imagine a bomb going off in their face, and the grays often will leave at that point. That doesn't mean they won't be back the next night or the next week, but you may be able to stop something from happening that night or that particular time using an offensive emotion at them. They seem to like to have fear from us, and they like to have sexual intensity from us, but they're not real crazy at anger that's aimed at them.
And the second part of the question, dealing with children?
Well, I'm not a therapist, so I'm not going to pretend to answer that question. I agree with what Edith said, that it's mostly in listening and not letting the child feel that you do not believe the child, that they'll be open to talk to you about what happens.
I would like to just say one thing in relationship to what Dr. Boylan has said. I've seen traumatized children. I don't work with children any longer, but as special favors to some of my ongoing patients, I have seen their children, work with them for a while, and or refer them to a colleague. But they have been very highly traumatized. Bedwetting, not having to sleep on the floor next to the parents, not being able to go in the hall, having a phobia, the very same things that happen to adults. So it isn't like these are benign experiences for these children. I mean, they maybe, in some cases, they may be their little blue friends. One person referred to the child as the little blue doctors. But other kids are very, very traumatized, just like the adults are. They have symptoms, terrible symptoms. So it's not something, I mean, I would not want it for my children or grandchildren at all. I mean, if they came to me crying and screaming and saying there are people there, I wouldn't just say, relax, this is for your benefit. Absolutely not. And of course, I would more or less know what was going on. I'd get help for them, and I would just feel horrible that I couldn't stop it from happening. I think that would be the worst thing as a parent to feel.
Giles, did you want to address those two-part questions?
I haven't worked with children very much. I run it on occasion. One little lady I got that I've been hypnotizing for some while, she's been abducted and all kind of things has happened through her, and she brought me one thought, said she thought one of her little daughters, I believe was about 7, 8 years old, had had a visitation one night and brought her to me for hypnosis. And sometimes I have fair luck with children above 6 years old. It's not one of my preferences to work with, but anyway, it's on the level they are. As I mentioned, the little girl in particular called them watermelon heads, I guess, talking about the craze, and it was right open and joyful for her. I had one little boy in a channeling session with his father, said that they would start picking him up, and supposedly was to pick him up this particular night. And there was quite a lot of information, and after that, the next night, they was all in my living room, and this little boy was real young. He would sit down and draw one flying saucer after another, draw inside of the flying saucer, make a fairly good drawing of being beamed up, and et cetera, and et cetera. And it's something the way they can express it sometimes.
Thank you. Dr. Harter, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to make sure that the audience understands that many of the people who are reporting these things are reporting them on the basis of people who come to them in trouble. And it would be a real mistake, I think, to call it and to unify the whole thing out there and to make it easier for us to discuss it, to be sure. But if you just talk about people who come to you in trouble and who are traumatized, and children, I have lots of children who are perfectly happy, and they understand it a lot better than their parents. They don't have that reaction at all. I have a 1, 2.5, or 3-year-old, when she can remember, when she was 2.5, she saw the moon, and she said to herself later on, the moon is going to come down and visit me. And the moon was out in the backyard when she went there at 3 o'clock at night, and she had a very calm, very pleasant, no examination. They just wanted to say hello. Later on, when she was 12, they saw her more. And these are, in my experience, far more typical than the scare stories that come to the attention of psychotherapists.
May I just comment?
Sure.
Since I'm a psychotherapist, many adults, after remembering, a particular abduction, I'll ask them to go back and remember their first one, and it occurred as a child, and invariably it was very traumatic. Now, there are cases in which a kind person or being will come and say, I will see you when you're 12 years old or whatever, and they establish a good relationship. So not all of the cases are negative, but I would say that in doing a regressive hypnotic analysis to the very first one, it definitely was negative. In about 95% of the cases, these kids were traumatized.
Thank you. Next question.
I have a few observations and a question I'd like to address. One to Mr. Hamilton. There's Dr. Hamilton.
No, Giles Hamilton.
Giles. You mentioned the cigar-shaped ship, and I have heard about ships that were so huge that they would be as large as the city of Los Angeles floating above us. I wonder if any of you have had any experience with any reports of something like that.
I've had them reported, mentioned a while ago, and described, and said the only way one fellow, he described it, he said the only way I know how to describe it is humongous. I had them described not as big as Los Angeles at St. Augustine. I had one described through a channeling session one time that everybody in St. Augustine, Florida could be put in it. I've had them described as 10 miles long, and it's unreal. It's unreal.
Then I had a question for Dr. Turner. In listening to the Billy Goodman show, which you may not be familiar with, it was emanated from KDEG here in Las Vegas from 89 to 90, about almost a year's period before it got shut down because of Global 2000, the Kissinger depopulation plan. And in it, there were calls, people calling up about dismemberment of people and backs of limbs and legs and things. And one girl called up and said that she had been affected and her left arm was growing longer than her right. And then I have a friend in a desert locality who swears that she has seen people who don't move properly. Their legs and bend wrong, and they bend wrong, and she believes that they're surrounded by these people who are brewing drugs for CIA-like projects.
Is there a question like, have I heard this material?
Yes. Are you familiar with any of this material?
Within the cases, and I will limit this to the virgin cases, these are people who were not into ufology before their experiences surfaced or before they began to find out about it. We have several reports of underground facilities where bodies are processed, and we have had very similar, if not identical, descriptions of certain things, not that you would think of if you were trying to make up this description that makes it suspiciously believable that they have seen or have been induced to think they've seen the same sort of place. Whether these are real experiences or false experiences, they are multiple experiences because we have several people totally unrelated reporting these. They have seen bodies being processed, often coming from Arkansas. One said like the chickens at the Tyson Chicken Factory, and could hear the sounds of the bodies being dismembered. Others have, two other people have described seeing human bodies hanging upside down with blood being drained out of them, and one said they were stacked like cords of wood in an area. They have also, two different people have reported seeing humans who seem to be in a zombie-like or catatonic state working on the assembly processing area and did not seem to be doing it willingly. Yes, the underground places have come up in virgin cases, not in UFO fanatic cases, not in people who've read this material. We've also had one where two people were abducted to a facility they were told was a joint alien-human disease control center, and they were given inoculations. They both had partial conscious memory of this when it was over with, and one of them was so disturbed by it he wanted to seek regression help to find out what else happened. The ETs came back to him and said they warned him not to do this. He was not to look into this any further, and if he did, they would kill the other man who was with him, and they described a very peculiar situation in which this death would occur. And he told his friend what message he had received about this, and the man encouraged him to go ahead and try to find out because they were both concerned to know the truth. He did seek regression on the first time when he got back to the state where he lived with this other man. The man was in the hospital and did die within 24 hours in the most bizarre situation that was not a medically induced problem at all, and it matched exactly what the ETs had warned his friend would happen to him if he did seek regression. I know that's the horror stories nobody wants to hear, nobody wants to talk about, and they're not politically acceptable, but these cases are as valid as any other case. Whether there is validity across the board, that's something you're going to have to decide.
Dr. Well,
The cases I present to you represent people who I've screened for psychological serious disturbance. And as a result of that, I have 0 cases of such lurid tales. I think the inference there need not be elaborated further.
We understand the inference. I really do.
Well, it's not a lack of evidence, it's not evidence of lack, of course. And I think we have to take everyone's data as it may pertain to something, but not necessarily infer that it's the whole thing that is happening. Now, there are many instances, and I have investigated people who have had some experiences in some of these underground facilities, and they're not very nice experiences. And they have involved certain kinds of extraterrestrials, and according to their testimony, humans. And it's the humans that are doing the bad stuff. Not that they're not in some kind of collaboration, but I want us to make sure that if we get into this wild stuff, that we realize that it may not be anything but it's all typical, and it may be something that we as humans need to ourselves face, because it's not. These people are being paid out of black budgets, right? And I think it's time that perhaps one of our new presidents is encouraged to look into some of the things that our own humans are doing and making it appear in many instances to be alien malfeasances.
I'd like to add one more thing here.
And I want to rebut just a second.
Dr. Turner made a very interesting statement that this was just as valid as anything else that was presented. And she was not claiming that it was valid or invalid. And I think that you have to look at all that we've told you as, you just have to see whether it fits right for you. You cannot take any of this as facts. Some things are facts that we're telling you, but when it comes to what is remembered under hypnosis, that's why I use the term clinical validity. If somebody has a symptom and they remember something and they get over the symptom, to me there's a clinical validity, but it still could be a fantasy. It just doesn't make sense to me as a fantasy. But in other words, what she said could be a fantasy, I mean, the man did die, but on the other hand, it could be completely true, and I think you have to look at everything that we say up here in that light.
Certainly there would be records, wouldn't there?
Yes, of course, and I would like to absolutely resent, Richard, the implication that I can't tell a deranged person from a sane person. This person in particular that we're talking about is a second-in-command city official of a large area. He is certainly competent in every other form of his life. There is no indication of any mental illness. There are medical records to go with this. He absolutely will not go public with the story because he is frankly scared to death. In the other cases of the people reporting the underground facilities, as I said, if you want to give me a criteria to judge their mental capacity, I'll be happy to apply it, but I hope you would think I would know better. I mean, I don't have a PhD in psychology, but I've certainly had a training in ascerning and discerning material and people that I would not work with anyone I suspected of mental disturbance. I would send them to a therapist. And none of these cases I've talked about qualify as mentally disturbed.
Go ahead. Rebuttal of rebuttal. Only a qualified psychotherapy professional can discern people's psychological states. It's not as simple as they're schizophrenic or they're well. There is for example, delusional disorder representing one narrow band of delusional thinking where everything else about the person is perfectly high functioning. Arguably, certain people have headed Fortune 500 corporations and perhaps headed the United States as president with such a disorder and function very well from many criteria of functioning. The other thing I should say to this is psychological disturbance does not just include delusional states and other such clinical entities. As I said further, the evidence I think is mounting that there is a serious black operations, probably military intelligence mediated effort to stage pseudo-abductions and pseudo-alien chambers with the most god-awful stuff, of which I'm sure these reports represent just a sample, designed to peddle the psychological warfare agenda that the aliens are evil and we need to crank up the Star Wars weapons and blow them out of orbit. I cannot show you the classified documents to prove this. I think the evidence will continue to mount. But what I have seen so far from people inside government, including victims, is that such is going on and accounts for much of the dark alien worst case scenarios.
Moderator's prerogative here, please. Are you not giving at all the possibility that the particular case that Dr. Turner just cited could have happened? It seems as though it's going a little bit beyond an educational program, a covert educational program, if in fact there has been a very high strangeness death associated with this.
Yeah, there have been more than one.
Well, I don't.
I mean,
what can I say? The covert folks, killing somebody does not give them pause if the stakes are high enough.
I see, okay.
That's certainly not a criterion that it can't be covert ops.
All right, then, okay, so then my understanding is that you're saying, yes, certainly this could have happened, but you don't particularly think that it's alien influence.
Well, I don't rule out a few criminal elements in the lower aliens working with criminal elements on our side, but I take exception that that is being pandered about as the representative case or the very large percentage case of what's going on.
Oh, okay, fine. That clears it up for me. Thank you. Dr. Harter,
I would also echo that we don't talk about it very much because the evidence is a little bit fragmented, but it's getting more solid. And that evidence that there is one group of what Dr. Boylan calls the low life of the universe is working with some of the lowlife of the U.S. government. And who they are, of course, they won't tell you. They don't even. But there's a $35 billion black budget, and that's enough to cover a lot of activities. But I only want to make sure that we understand that this is not a unitary thing. This is not something you can blame the aliens for. In fact, if 95% of them are actually, they abhor this whole thing, and perhaps they'll have something that they can do about it from the other side. But we've got to think about what we can do about it from our side. We've got to get this world in order. This is just a, perhaps even this is a small point relative to the other things we have to do about controlling population, ecology, and many other things that they are trying to encourage us to do, to encourage us to take on a more spiritual and loving attitude towards each other. These are the main issues I think we have to address. And this other stuff is a sideshow. It's very serious, and it's very serious to the people who are being involved, but I shouldn't wish us to think that this is something that is essentially central to what we really want to talk about.
I wouldn't like to leave the impression, as I think somebody might have, that I think all the alien contact is negative. I have never said that, and I don't believe that. And the cases that have had some definitely negative things happen have also the same people had positive things happen. I do think there's more than one group at work here. What I'm trying to do by pointing out this other side of it is balance the picture a little bit, because you get a whole lot of how wonderful the aliens are, and you get very little about the other side of it, and both things are as valid, one as the other. And to say, why should we want to stop them coming in, for instance? Well, you don't know when the door opens or the psychic door opens which one's coming in. We need to know what all sides of these aspects include. I'll just leave it at that.
Next question.
The first question, it's been my understanding that the Greys, the so-called Greys, are here doing the genetic experiments with us primarily to create this hybrid race, being that they are more technical and lack some of the emotion that we have. They're trying to create some kind of a master race, or a race that can have the best of their qualities and the best of our qualities. And I'm just curious as to what your understanding of this is, what your views of this are.
Are you addressing it to a specific
I'm sorry,
member?
yeah, any one of the panel members.
Okay, so we can start at the end and work this way. The Gray's purpose.
Well, first of all, we're making a certain amount of inferences. We're making hypotheses on the basis of very limited information. That there would be hybridization makes sense to some people who don't know very much about biology and how many millions of base pairs there are in the human genome. The Human Genome Project is beginning to appreciate it's a fantastic problem. Now, to hybridize human physical bodies, fantastic problem and hardly worth it. But if you want to improve a person's psychology and making him a more loving person, more psychologically capable of dealing with things in a positive way, that might be a hybridization of a certain kind that's relatively easily effective. Right? That makes a lot more sense to me than that there should be this crazy physical hybrid system, which is biologically and technically not necessarily impossible, but so far so difficult that it doesn't seem to be any worthwhile. I mean, after all, humans are perfectly well adapted to our environment here. Oxygen does not smell bad to us. Nitrogen smells good.
I expect I'm meaning primarily from their purpose and why we're there.
But you see, you're asking a question about their purpose about something we don't even know is happening, okay? So you can't make an inference about something you're not sure is actually true, okay?
I guess I was just curious about things I had heard.
In just about every case of a CE4, the eggs or sperm or fetus is taken, and even if the child is, even if the person is immature, like if they're a 9-year-old boy when this is happening, obviously it seems to me that that would be an immature sample of sperm. But they obviously are taking these eggs. It seems to be the only thing they're taking. Well, they take a little bit of the skin, and so they're either studying us to study the development, but as somebody made the point, they know all about us anyway, but I'm not sure. I mean, that's the researchers' inference. But what I do find is that they do indeed take eggs, sperm, fetuses. I've also had people who have been taken back to the ships and shown hybrid babies, and you're going to meet one of these people. My experience, I brought one. We'll be talking about that today. So at least in one case that we'll be seeing today, this has happened, and my memory serves me, there have been plenty of others too. Now, why are they doing this? First of all, I don't know whether we can believe what they tell us. And secondly, it would seem to me that if they are taking the eggs and the sperm, maybe I'm a little paranoid, but I think they're creating the ultimate spy because they've got a human being. And they can do a test tube baby and have a human being that would be indistinguishable from us, raise them in that culture and put them into our culture. Their bodies would be adapted to this culture. Maybe they'd be in some kind of sealed environment there, but they would be a wonderful spy. I mean, this would be great. Since all of our governments have spies in every other place, why can't they have some spies? So that's one thing. And why they're doing the hybridization, I don't know. There's some kind of theories that they don't have emotions and they can bring emotions in, or they're weak and they need our genes. I don't know. I mean, that information is not clear, but that it is being done seems clear to me. I said there's some things that are theoretical and some things that are fact, and if this business, if anything that comes out under hypnosis can be valid, I do find that this is being done routinely.
Rich, the Gracebergs.
Well, first of all, there's a number of races or different source types that could arguably fall under the general flabby moniker of the Greys. So we've got that problem. Multiple presumed star system origins of folks that may look vaguely similar. That's just one part of the problem. I do not find in my research that the majority of cases involve reproductive product specimen taking. There is a significant minority of cases in which that does occur, the purposes of which can be inferred. First of all, sperm and ovum are a fine example of DNA. They embody a very classy form of a sample of the entire human being. Obviously, that's where babies come from, why they resemble their parents. There does seem to be among certain of the races that are relatively at the low end of the evolutionary spectrum some fertility product processing. It seems to go in two ways, one of which is to tune up the next generation of kids. This is partially information, partially inferred by perhaps modifying the genetic code of the fertility product and then reinserting it in the contributor so that their subsequent children will have enhanced qualities. Another line of endeavor appears to be borrowing these products possibly for use on off-planet subsequent fertility. A third case seems to be borrowing these products, reinserting them, having the person, woman in this case, begin a gestation period, and then at the first trimester, removing the fetus for further growth in a off-planet site for purposes we are not clear about.
I'd like to just add something for a few moments here. I did a regression in Berlin on a reporter for the International UFO Symposium, and he was taken aboard a craft, was forced to have intercourse with his girlfriend. She got pregnant, the baby was taken, and he was very disturbed and started to cry and all that sort of thing. And then later was told by them that this person, that his child would be a boy, and it would be very helpful. It'd be a great contribution to mankind. And so he felt so much better. And he really felt good. So we went the whole gamut in that regression. But in other words, I did want to say that besides maybe having him as a spy, which is my thought, that coming out of that regression was that this child would be put back here as a plant. He would be a human child, but he would be very, very helpful to the world.
Giles, did you have a comment on that?
No, not really. I can't add a whole lot to this because, like I said, I've only dealt in the gray stuff a little bit for the last year, and I have one woman, I don't know why, apparently in her shin down there. I've got a slide of it at home where they took out a particle of bone, and I'm finding, I don't know if they finding out, a lot of times, particularly in women under the hairline, we find in implants. It looks something like a birthmark. It's not in one particular concentrated piece. It's flaky. It's covers usually an inch, sometimes 2 inches, like a light birthmark, and it's not all red. It's kind of mingledy like, and this seems to be the ones that they usually channel through. Whenever I find this back of the neck, they usually will make mental contact, and that's about all I have to add.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. I'm sorry for the one yes and no.